would you go ahead and please lead us in the pledge this evening for us?
I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all.
Thank you, City Manager. Now we'll move on to public comment on items not on the agenda. City Clerk? You need to unmute yourself. I can't hear you.
Thank you. If any members of the public who are in the meeting would like to speak, you can please raise your hand at this time. It's a button at the bottom of your screens. I don't see that we have any people calling into the meeting. So you should see a button on the bottom of your screen that says raise your hand. It's a blue icon.
And again, this is for items that are not on the agenda.
And I am not seeing any hands raised at this time.
Nor am I. All right, we're going to move on to announcements and presentations. Item A, 2020 census. Paper versions of the 2020 census questionnaires are being mailed to all residents who have not yet responded. It is not too late. You can submit your census by visiting my2020census.gov or by calling 1-844-330-2020 or mailing in your paperless version. Folks, every vote does count, and what we do get is kind of a scenario of how we're doing within the county week to week. So the good news is for San Mateo County, this last week it became first, surpassing Santa Clara in the state for responses, which is great at 62.9%. San Bruno, unfortunately, out of the 20 jurisdictions, we're in 16th place when it comes to responding back. We have surpassed the 60%. However, we obviously 61.4. The good news is we went up 3.9% from the prior week, which puts us in second as far as increasing our number within a week's time. So that's the good news. But the important news is that we need to get counted. It's important. There's various options: phone, mail, computer, etc. So the important thing is to take the time, please. It's very simple, but we really need to all be counted. This is how we get funding. This is how this county is going to get its resources that in end will help our community. So I very much encourage all of us to do that. Next, item B. Contractors working for the San Francisco Public Utilities Commission are replacing a water transmission pipeline that crosses Crystal Springs Road. This essential construction work will temporarily close Crystal Springs Road between Cunningham Way and Crestmore Drive to all traffic except emergency vehicles on weekends between 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. At 7 a.m. and 5 p.m. between April 20th and May 29th. Please allow additional transit time during this period. To learn more about this and other essential projects, please visit sanbruno.ca.gov/news. sanbruno.ca.gov/news. Moving on to item C, I apologize, under 5. Presentation by Caltrans on the Alamany deck replacement project. And we are very fortunate to have a person that will be giving that to us. And may I ask Ms. Cheryl Chambers if she would be so kind as to go ahead and make that presentation.
Hi, good evening, everyone. Apologies for not being able to be seen on this computer that has most of my information on it to share with you. So I wanted to start with a little background on why we ended up pursuing an earlier start. So let me share my screen with you. And so one of the things that we considered was the fact that the shelter in place reduced traffic 40 to 60%. Our goal had been in July, when this was originally scheduled, to seek a 30% reduction by doing some of the things that we're doing now, asking people to telework, asking more people to get out of their cars and use transit and just not be on the roads. And so with this reduction, the city of San Francisco and also the contractor was able to accelerate the plans. So we started construction on the deck on last Friday. And I'll show you some photos of where we're going. But because of the freeway impacts, we've also had local detours, but not as many. I will go through some of the specifics, but for those of you who have been driving north on 101, we've been diverting traffic onto northbound 280. And so many of you have seen the following detour. Let me find it. Apologies. So many of you have seen this detour, which is taking you on to 280, either downtown or over to Daly City. And so a couple of days ago, we were able to move from the northbound deck, and I'll share with you our website where you can get a lot of information. And so this is 101alamanniproject.com website. And so on this website, we've got daily updates where you can find out what the work is that's going on. And one of the neat resources on this site, and hopefully it'll work for me, is we've got a live streaming camera. So the southbound traffic that's coming on 101, as of yesterday, we detoured that traffic. You're seeing right now a live shot. Those cars are going on the new rebuilt 101. So that's southbound traffic. So right now we're rebuilding the South Bridge, and our goal is to finish that sometime within the next few days. And when that's done, then we'll do some additional work on northbound 101, and then we'll open up both sections. We also anticipate that Alamany, which is closed off to local traffic, east and westbound, will be opened up, hopefully, if not this weekend, early next week. So I also want to encourage anybody who wants to get information that they can go to the website and sign up for the mailing list. We're emailing out advisories and also the daily updates. Additionally, we do a live broadcast on Twitter at 10 a.m. and 5 p.m., just to let people know what's going on, and also on Facebook. So there's a lot of information out there. We've got a hotline for people that if they have any concerns, we address that 2 or 3 times a day. And we've been monitoring the noise. So to the extent where we're hoping to get this done in the next few days with the deck, there's still going to be night work for the residents. But for those of you that will be coming out of the shelter in place at the end of May, we don't want to be in your way and have the deck done at that time. So I encourage you to go to the website. If you have any questions, I'm available to try to answer them at this time.
Any questions from my colleagues?
This is Councilmember Davis. I wanted to say thank you for that. What an awesome tool to be able to see a live update for anybody wanting to travel and kind of understand sort of the traffic backup, et cetera. So, and better time to do it than now.
Yeah, thank you. And, I did mention it, but 511 and Waze and Google Maps are also tracking the travel and the work so that people can try to get around it. We're just saying, unless you have some essential reason to go through that construction area, just avoid it.
Anything else, colleagues? Staff, anybody need to ask anything? Then Ms. Chambers, I want to thank you very much for zooming in with us this evening and giving us that presentation and bringing us up to speed on what's going on. Appreciate it very much.
Thank you, Mayor. Thank you, council members. Have a good evening, and look forward to letting you know when we're totally done with it.
Thank you again.
Good night.
We look forward. Bye-bye. Let's move on to item D, receive report and review status of local emergency related to repairs to Crestmore Canyon and continuing declaration of local emergency. Director Tan. Jimmy, you need to unmute.
Good afternoon, Honorable Mayor, members of the City Council, Public Works Director Jimmy Tan. I'm here to provide a brief update on the Crestmore Canyon project. As mentioned in the previous update on April 14th, the majority of the major construction work for the installation of the wall structure has been completed. And since this last council meeting, staff has already completed the discussions with the contractor, Hillside Drilling, in regards to the change orders, and the total change orders is approximately $94,000. The installation of the guardrails and the removal and replacement work for the sidewalks are also complete. If you drive by there, you'll notice those items in place. Currently, the staff is waiting for the fence contractor to install the cable fence that's supposed to be on top of the wall structure that was recently built. So certain components of these cable fences needs to be galvanized. So it will take approximately maybe 1 to 1.5 weeks to get that completed. And we anticipate this cable fence to be installed, within about 2 weeks time frame. So once that's completed, the remaining work will be to pave the westbound lane of San Bruno Avenue. So that's pretty much it. So this concludes my presentation, and I'll be happy to answer any questions.
Any questions from council?
None here.
Okay, I see no hands, either on the screen or in the air. I'll go ahead and thank you very much, Jimmy, for the update. We appreciate it. We'll move on to item E, to receive update on COVID-19 response efforts and preliminary financial impacts. City Manager.
Hi, we have a little feedback, so 1 second. All right. I will give a presentation on COVID-19 and give the community an update. So we counted, and I think we're on our 43rd day of the shelter-in-place order. And we know now that it has been extended locally to the end of May. So the object of this presentation is to provide the general public with an update on COVID-19 and everything the city is doing with regard to the shelter-in-place order and the public health pandemic. Our agenda, we will provide a high-level overview of a few county statistics. We'll talk a little bit about the order. We'll talk about a resource guide that the community received in the mail. We'll highlight again a number of the resources that are available for the public and our small businesses. We'll have a public service announcement from our police chief, and then I'm here to take questions from the city council. So an update on statistics. As of yesterday, total cases in our county is 1,099. There are a total number of deaths of 48. And the best resource that we continue to point the community to is the San Mateo County Health Department. And they have created a dedicated coronavirus website, and that is on the screen. So if you have any questions with regard to the order or statistics, it is a website with a wealth of information. And again, in this presentation, we wanted to provide just a snapshot of the data dashboard, and that is on the screen before you. And it provides a look at the total cases by day, a look at total new cases, age range, and so continues to be affecting every age group. Males and females about the same proportionately, and the number of deaths are still affecting our senior community more than our younger community, and no one under the age of 50 has passed in our county. So everyone over all of the 48 deaths have been individuals 50 or older. Just wanted to provide a highlight on 2 statistics. Remember, everything we are doing with our shelter-in-place order is aimed at lowering the bell curve. This is the total number of cases by day. And so as you saw in the prior statistics, it's currently at 1,099. A different way to look at that data are the number of new cases by day. And so what this graph shows the council and the community is that we are still trending downward on the number of new cases per day, hovering as of yesterday at just around 20 new cases. We are not at the lowest point, which was just under, or the lowest point, should I say, in April, which was just at about 5 cases at the beginning of April. But we are nowhere near the nearly 80 cases that was the spike. And so the number of cases that are tested and confirmed each day is on the downward trend, but really over the last 2 weeks, fluctuating between 40 to 20 cases per day in our county. Shelter in place order has a number of things that are restricted. We have modified our city operations, and all of our sport courts are closed. Most construction is prohibited. All of our picnic tables and areas, barbecue areas are closed, but the public are able to use the park. Unfortunately, you cannot use the dog parks, and all of our group sporting events have been canceled. And we have still canceled all of our board, commission, and committee meetings for the city. We are looking to resume a number of those beginning in the month of May. The next thing I want to talk about or touch on is that we all know that the county announced that they would be extending the shelter-in-place order for San Mateo County through the end of May. However, the details of that have yet to be released. What the county did say as of yesterday is that the restrictions will largely remain the same through the end of May, but the new order would include a limited easing of some restrictions that are thought to have a low risk or be a low risk activity. And so as a county, we are still waiting for what those are, and we expect them by the end of this week. As we all know, masks are required, or some face covering, should I say, is required. And so a scarf, a bandana, a turtleneck, that went into effect starting at midnight on April 27th. So we have been providing a number of graphics to remind the community of this on all of our social media platforms. And the graphic on the left-hand side is what is in our city offices that apparently has my picture, but that of some of our other staff, just reminding people that are working here as essential workers that when they're within 6 feet of each other, they need to wear masks. The community also received, I received mine this Saturday in my mail, and I think most of the community received their special COVID-19 resource guide in the mail. It is a wealth of information developed by your very own City of San Bruno employees on COVID-19. The guide is available on our website in Spanish, as well as nearly any other language, and can be translated using the Google Translate feature. And so to go online, you go to our normal web address, sanbruno.ca.gov/COVID-19 guide. And on the bottom, you can translate that into nearly any language. But I really just want to take a moment to congratulate our staff on taking the initiative to put this mailer together and actually repurposing funds that were going to be used for our spring recreation guide that unfortunately was canceled due to the cancellation of our recreation programs. So COVID-19 testing still remains something of primary interest to our residents. Testing, unfortunately, is still limited, and it is limited based on screening criteria. The best site is still verily.com for our community if you are experiencing COVID-19 symptoms, or you would like to go on just to see if you are eligible. The eligibility requirements will change over time, but the free testing in our county is available at verily.com. There are a number of other private testing facilities. The best way to access that is through your primary care physician. On the screen, we have the information for Kaiser and also Dignity Health. And we do have a Dignity Health COVID-19 testing site in San Bruno at the Dignity Health Urgent Care Center. That is a paid service, but residents can go on to the Dignity Health website and acquire a test through Dignity Health. One of the things that we also want to provide the community as a resource is for we know that there is a lot of stress with regard to COVID-19 and the shelter-in-place order. And CORAsupport.org is an amazing resource, and we encourage anyone in the community that may be experiencing abuse or is just overwhelmed to go to CORA. Their number is 1-800-300-1080. Our virtual recreation guide is receiving a lot of use from the community and was updated this week. And so we encourage the community, especially those that are home with kids, either doing homeschool or just annoying their parents, like my kids do sometimes, to go to the virtual recreation site. It has a wealth of information to help parents and frankly, anyone of all ages with virtual ways to stay active, both physically and mentally. Livestream story time available Tuesdays and Thursdays at 11:15 a.m. So for the little kiddos, just before nap time, hopefully. And that is put on by our very own City of San Bruno Library. Small business assistance. There was a major milestone just yesterday with San Mateo County Strong launching their application process for the SMC Strong initiative. And there is over $1 million in grants available countywide through the Small Business Grant Program. And we encourage any small business to go to SMC Strong and apply for those funds. Sam Cita and Roseanne Frost was at the April 14th City Council meeting and provided the City Council with an amazing update on everything that Sam Cita is doing to help strong business or small business in San Bruno. This can be accessed through the City of San Bruno's COVID-19 homepage, and we'll talk about that in 1 second. Another thing that we wanted to highlight is partnering with the partnership that we have with the San Bruno Community Foundation and the Chamber of Commerce, both which have really been a partner to the city's Emergency Operations Center and participating from the beginning, really when we activated on March 16th, working and thinking about ways to support the San Bruno business community. And without further ado, adhering to the shelter in place has been a topic of significant discussion. And as the community knows, we have developed a number of public safety announcements, and we wanted to take a moment to show the community the latest. And let me click play. And that's not working, so let me click pause.
Hello, everyone. I'm Ryan Johansson, your Chief of Police here in San Bruno, and just wanted to send out a quick message to talk a little bit about where we're at with the shelter-in-place order, and specifically about your police department's enforcement posture as it relates to the shelter-in-place order. First, I'd like to take just a quick moment to stress my level of how impressed I am with the way this community has responded to these really difficult circumstances. I think that we've had a very high level of compliance with some difficult requirements in the shelter-in-place order, and as a result, we're starting to see a little light at the end of the tunnel, which is pretty exciting. And my hat's off to all of you for the part you've played in doing that. That being said, I know that as we all go about our daily business and this kind of new normal for the time being, it's easy to see that it appears that people around us, or not all people around us, are complying with the shelter-in-place orders. And I know that your police department plays a role in increasing compliance and trying to protect all of us in these difficult times. I will say that the posture of the police department as it pertains to enforcement has not changed, which is that we believe strongly that the right way to handle these circumstances is through a posture of persuasion and education of the public as to what the orders are and the importance of following them, rather than taking a posture of strict enforcement of the orders, which can be challenging and also probably is not necessary given the way that things work in our community. And that being said, there are times in which enforcement is going to be appropriate. And I wanted to touch a little bit on the role that you as the public play in helping us to kind of gauge that and handle it. To be quite frank, there are a number of violations of the shelter-in-place order that we would like the public's help in reporting so that we can address them. But these are the more egregious violations that are a little bit easier for us to take on as a police department with all of the other things that we have going on. Some examples, of course, would be large-scale gatherings in public places. Big parties at parks and things of that nature are certainly concerning. Large-scale construction projects that involve big crews of people and appear to be non-essential or unnecessary. These are the kinds of things that we would like for you to call and notify your police department about. Another example might be an essential business like a restaurant or a grocery store in which really there's just no regard for the social distancing parameters at all, and where you really need the police department's help to kind of get these businesses on board and helping to protect us all while staying open. However, there are some examples of things that, while you will see them day to day, really there's no point in reporting to the police department, either because the violations are very minor or difficult to prove, or because they are just a real drain on resources because of their volume, or they're transitory in nature and difficult for us to come across. Some examples of this would be calling in people who aren't wearing masks. Quite frankly, there are some specific terms under which people are not required to wear masks under this shelter-in-place order. And so calling in to report seeing someone on the street who wasn't wearing a mask really doesn't serve very much purpose and can be a real drain on resources. Also calling in, people who you believe from your observations simply do not appear to be complying with the shelter-in-place order, meaning that they're out and about for what doesn't appear to be essential business. This is obviously really, really difficult to prove and very difficult for us to respond to. Most of those folks will in fact be out for some essential or legitimate business such as exercise or obtaining supplies. And so we really would prefer if you not bother reporting those things to us. So if you see these more egregious violations and you want to report it to the police department so that we can help take care of all of us, the right way to do that is to call our non-emergency phone number. That's at 650-616-7100, as opposed to reporting it through any other medium. That will give us the most prompt response and the best ability to handle it appropriately. So I'll just close by kind of saying on a little bit of a more emotional note that I've been with your police department for about 15 years. And that means that I've been here in the city through a number of trying times, right? We're no stranger to challenge and we're no stranger to tragedy. I worked here as a detective during the pipeline explosion. I also worked here at the active shooter incident at YouTube and the shooting incident at Tan Fran and countless other critical incidents that we've faced together as a community. And in each case, I've been nothing short of awed and inspired by the resiliency of this community and by its ability to get through these times by bonding together and taking care of one another. And I'm extremely confident that this will be no exception to that. So again, please don't hesitate to report the egregious violations to us, but instead, let's try to put our primary focus on how we work together, take care of one another, encourage each other to comply with the orders and get through this sooner rather than later. So thanks so much for taking a few moments to watch this video. I hope it was helpful, and you'll be hearing from me again soon. Thank you. Stay healthy.
All right, so that concludes our presentation. And I want to thank the City Council and thank all staff that are helping to protect the community during this pandemic. Thank you.
Thank you, City Manager. Any questions or comments from my colleagues?
Through the chair.
Yes, please.
I just wanted to thank the city manager for the presentation. I think that was great. And I wanted to comment on the chief's video. I think he's definitely a natural. I felt like I was watching an episode of Cops. I could hear the music in my head. That was really good. So thanks for putting that together. I think it's important to get those messages out.
Laura.
Thank you so much, Jovan and staff for putting together the mailer. I really appreciate the time and the effort that was put in. And I know there's a lot of great detail, especially contacting businesses to see who's still open in our community. It's a great handy guide. It's a good resource material. If anything, it's a list of places to go for dinner for takeout tomorrow night. But more importantly, it really provides the information for those residents who just don't know. They're not connected to the internet like most of us are. They really don't know who to call, and they really are left at home without the information. So excellent job, way to go. And thank you for continuing to report good numbers and to continue to see it decline. And I want to just end, I think, as hard as it is, and as we go through these next 30 days, it is so important that we all keep our 6 feet and that we don't do the things that we want to do and we feel like this is enough. I've done this. I've done this. I got to hear somebody who was a medical provider in New York just share very heartfelt concerns, and everything we do, we cross the line, we're definitely endangering our healthcare providers. And so don't be selfish. Really stay home, take care of yourself, wear your mask, keep your distance, and wash your hands. I get a report that I know that there's some concerns from the council members that water rates are going up or their water usage is going up, and actually the contrary. Water usage is declining in San Mateo County. I assume that would be the same in our city, that we really are being conservative at home. So you're washing your hands and we're being conservative. And I think you gotta love San Bruno who does care, because if you're not giving back, find a great organization, a great fund to give back to, because there are many people that are in need. Thanks so much.
Any other of my colleagues, Marty or Linda? Marty.
Sure, Mayor. This is a difficult time, and we just have to we have to wear it out. We have to just keep on doing what we're doing. The numbers are low, but let's not try to be creative in getting around the social distancing. I mean, it's terrible for myself, it's terrible that baseball season got canceled in San Bruno, right? We found out yesterday. But that's the reality. We want to take care of this problem. So continue doing all the good things. Thank you. It's going to be another month or so, but I think we'll be all better for it. So thank you.
Thank you. Linda, did you?
I just want to thank everybody who's working, in particular, all of our grocery stores that we have in San Bruno. I went in the other day to a massive line at Lucky's and Molly Stone's. We hadn't gone shopping in weeks, and all of the grocery clerks that are going into work, all of the owners and managers who are enforcing the face coverings, just doing an excellent job keeping their workers safe and healthy. And then all of our small businesses that are really trying to stay open for the community. I just want to thank all of you guys, because it's been really a community effort to stay open, to provide services. And one group that I think we haven't thanked enough are all of our senior care facility workers who are not necessarily all the highest paid, but have such an important job taking care of our most vulnerable population, oftentimes who can't walk, who are sick, who are elderly. So I want to make sure that they get a thank you as well, because there are a lot of them in San Bruno, and it's such an important job. Thank you.
Thank you, my colleagues. I just had a few things. Just on the testing element, the county manager is still working on, there's one at the fairgrounds, but trying to get one in the south and one in the north. And that is currently still being worked on as of today when he made the statement. Also, it's affecting all of us, not just within here. Some interesting news that I did not know, but on Caltrans, we're noted for the 7th largest system within the country. And however, where we usually have a ridership of 65,000, it's down to 1,100 around as of today, which is down 98%. So we've gone from 92 trains to 42 trains, according to the CEO and manager. Speaking to the SFO director this morning, it was interesting that last year at this time, it was around 85,000 people. that went through the airport, and today it's around 1,800, down 97%. So it truly is affecting everybody in many places. And as noted, the results for the testing are going to come out in zip codes. They're hoping by the end of this week, but it's also important that the county wants it not to, there's going to hopefully be backup data to that, because the thing is, for example, Foster City and San Mateo share a zip code. So if you see that number, it's not just to say it's from one city to another, but these numbers have a lot of purpose behind them that really need to be looked at before making an assumption or where should I go or not. Also, I told talked to the Pacifica mayor, told her I would mention that still this last weekend, they had a lot of folks traveling to that city. They were out and enforcing and checking IDs, and there was just quite a few folks that were not from the area. And so they're still asking again. They understand it's challenging, but again, it's supposed to be 5 miles. And so I told her, Deidre, that I would pass that on. And just for some person, who had asked me about PG&E and, what happens when we get to, can we get to a power situation? I want to let you know that the county is very much in talks with PG&E to make sure that it's done in an appropriate fashion, trying to get you folks to give them updated information so they can keep in touch with you. The Emergency Services Council met Thursday, and I've asked for them and us as a county-based group to meet May 21st, which we're going to meet again. But the other jurisdictions are very on top of this because we know what that would bring to a community. So I want to let you know that on the county level and with my colleagues, everybody is working diligently. And to the staff, the magazine is something that I know this council very much is working on this year as communication, getting information out, having resources available. So I want to thank the council for that. I think we're unanimous on that, but also we want to thank the staff. It was a great publication that I've heard things about, very positive, a lot of information and resource, and all the other things that they're doing. As you know, it starts at the ground, and it starts with the staff that are providing the services and ensuring that this community still works. So want to thank staff for that as well. Is there anything else from my colleagues? If not, we're going to move on to our consent calendar. Is there anyone who wants to pull anything off to have a separate vote, not to have a discussion or some commentary, but just a separate vote? Any items?
Yeah, Councilmember, Mayor Medina, I apologize.
That's all right. Yeah.
I don't need a separate vote, but I did want to talk about the item number. I'm sorry. Oh, it was in reference to the paving.
G?
Yeah, sorry.
Okay.
I accidentally clicked on a different agenda.
No problem. And I want to make some comment just on H. Is there anybody else that wants anything else? Marty?
That would be F, please.
You got it. Anything else? Okay, hearing and seeing none. Do I have any action to approve consent items A through E? Need a motion.
Move to approve.
Move to second.
I have a motion by Salazar, seconded by Davis. We need a roll call, City Clerk.
Councilmember Davis,
Yes.
Councilmember Mason,
Yes.
Councilmember Medina,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Salazar,
Yes.
Mayor Medina.
Yes.
Motion carries.
Okay. Oh, and you know what? And I apologize, team, because we could have listened to the comments and then taken it all. So that's,
Yeah, that's what I got stumped.
got ahead of myself. So what I'm going to do is we're going to go through F, G, and H, and then we'll take them as a collective. So first, let's start with Marty's item, which was F, resolution accepting the project design, accepting the Susan Drive intersection improvement project as complete. Marty.
Yes. I brought this up because it's been an ongoing issue up in that area. And I know that it went through the TSPC and it came back to council, and staff were able to get this job done, I believe effectively. But I wanted to also allow staff to kind of give a quick little rundown on it, because it is more of a unique project that we've done that I have not seen done before here in San Bruno.
Sure.
Director Tan, please.
Yes. Good afternoon, Honorable Mayor, members of the City Council. I can provide a brief overview of the project. It is unique. It's something that we haven't done before. And initially, when we were looking at this site distance issue, staff brought the item to council with the recommendation of installing bulb outs at these intersections, but the cost of those were of concern. So staff was requested to look into other different measures, to have some similar effect at these intersections. So with that, staff came back to council to propose the installation of these curb extensions with these rubber bumpers, and then with some painted red curbs at these intersections, and then also the installation of these high visibility crosswalks. So 4 intersections were completed as part of this project: Fastman Drive and Susan Drive, Jeffrey Drive at Susan, as well as Summit Road and Elston Drive. So the city signed a contract with Chris Company in the amount of $57,000 for this project. And currently there was a change order of about close to $9,000. But the overall project had a budget of about 81. I'm sorry, which was approved for $100,000, and the total project is currently at $81,000. So this leaves a remaining budget of $18,000, which will be returned back to Measure A. So the thought is for the improvements to allow the cars that are at the the side streets when they're approaching Susan Drive to be able to move closer to Susan Drive, so that they'll be able to see the oncoming traffic from both directions, which additional red curbs and then the bulb outs would be able to help with that, with those visibility issues. So with that, I can answer any other questions that you may have. Thank you.
Marty?
Just wanted to follow up. Have there been any efforts to contact the residents in that area to see how they feel that they're working, to see how much easier it is for them to see around those vehicles?
We haven't reached out to any of the residents within that area. That's something that we can do if that's an interest from the council.
I think I would be interested in that. It was a pretty heated TSPC meeting, and I think it's effective. I've driven over there a few times, and I feel I can see a lot more as I'm trying to make those turns.
Okay.
Any other comments or questions from council?
Through the chair.
Mr. Salazar.
Yes. And just in terms of trying to evaluate how effective this all, I know there were some speed signs that were part of this, and I'm just wondering if there's a way to monitor the speed and see if it's any better now that feedback is there. I know we don't capture the data, but if we have data from prior to those signs going up and seeing how that looks now, that would be interesting to see just what the effect is. Because I know that was the other part of it. The visibility was one thing, but there's also a lot of speeding on that street.
Sure. The device that we installed, the speed sensor, the radar feedback signs that we installed at those along Susan Drive, there's one of them at Susan Drive, is capable of providing some data. And so we can take a look at that. We can download the information and take a look at whether there's any overall speeding in that stretch. It is a downhill towards College Drive from Susan, and there aren't too many stop signs within those intersections. So people do tend to go a little bit faster than normal, residential streets speed limits.
Yeah. Now both uphill and downhill, people like to go fast on that street. So yeah, any data would be, that would be great, just to see what kind of impact it had. So thank you.
Sure. Thank you.
Okay, also, I am toggling back and forth, but I'm seeing Mr. Stephen Seymour. I see a hand up, and I believe that you're asking to speak in regards to item F on the consent. So City Clerk, if you can, if you need to unmute and see if Mr. Seymour, if I've got him right on the F item that he wanted to speak on.
Can you hear me?
Yes, we can.
Okay. Honestly, it's not on the F item. It took me 40 minutes to get into this tonight. I really wanted a public comment. So if you want to move, I don't want to interrupt what you're talking about right now.
So is it on something else on the consent?
It's not on the consent. It took me more than 45
Okay.
minutes.
All right, all right.
And a lot of us, I mean, we're going back and forth with a bunch of
Mr. Seymour, I
Yeah.
appreciate, I hear what you're saying.
Yeah.
Let's, if it's not on this, I'm gonna get back and then we'll continue to move forward.
Yeah, that's what I said. Not now.
Okay.
Whenever you find time.
Thank you.
Yep.
Okay, if not, anything else, Marty? Good, okay. So why don't we go on to item G under consent, which is adopt a resolution. This is approving the design, authorizing the city manager to execute a construction contract with American Asphalt Repair and Resurfacing Company, Inc. for FY 1920 slurry steel project, and approving a construction contingency and appropriating $55,000 from Measure A fund balance. Laura.
Thank you. I just really want to kind of comment on this particular item because I think it's one of those things, and I'm sure for other council member who's been out talking to residents that, you know, when is my street going to get paved? Where are we at with, you know, why is the neighbor or the street around the corner getting paved, and why is my street not getting paved? And so I just, you know, a couple of things. So here we've got a $500,000 project. And this project is really only to slurry a handful of streets in San Bruno. And Jimmy, one of the questions, I don't know if you know this offhand, but what percentage of streets is this one project? Less than 10% of our streets. And slurry is not grinding them up and repaving them like a lot of streets needed. In addition, this project is really just to address some streets that fall into what we call collector or arterial streets. Can't say that right. But one of the things I will be asking council when we come back again is to provide really residents with an opportunity to say, well, where's my street on this list, right? We have what's called a PCI, which determines the grading of your street in terms of the condition of your street. And we know that overall San Bruno streets aren't in a great condition, and that we fall into 64 on the PCI. But more importantly, you live on a street, it hasn't been paved in many years, you want to know when, and where do I fall? And so I don't know, it's at some point that we can look at, you know, a 5-year plan, and what streets can possibly make it to the list. Maybe, you know, you can't hold us to it because things can change and funding changes as well. But this is it's an expensive item for just slurry. It's only a handful of streets, and I just think that residents care and want to know, which is why I wanted to actually kind of talk about it aside. There's a map that's included and a list of streets that are included with this presentation. So if you're logged in and you haven't had a chance to look at the agenda, it's a good opportunity to see which streets are on the list. Thank you.
Any other questions or comments from council?
Mr. Mayor?
Yes, Marty, please.
Yeah, I also was pulling this to discuss it a little bit because slurry is to take care of the streets that are in decent shape, to preserve that street so it doesn't degrade as quickly as others. We are in a situation where we have, as a council, now in the past, we have not had the funds available to do more repair and maintenance. And this is one of the reasons why I believe our residents supported Measure G. My comments on this project specifically are, I was curious how at the Marymount development, the whole interior of that development is being slurried. And then on the Marisol, it isn't. I could already imagine how somebody who lives just on that other part of that street in that development is going to say, why not mine? And that's pretty common, but because everybody wants their street to get a treatment. And I was wondering if, what was the thought behind that? In the future, as Councilmember Davis mentioned, I think it's important that we do have a schedule that, based on the amount of money that we would spend, how long is it going to take for all the streets in San Bruno to get done? And it's going to take a lot of time. Just that I think it'd be important to share that information as we're going forward to know how much % of the streets are being done currently, and with the next set of years of planning of how much money we're going to spend, which is going to be a lot, because just on this one little project, it's very expensive. So I'll leave those questions with the staff, and thank you.
Sure.
City Manager?
Yeah, why don't I just take the latter question, which is how long will it take us to pave all of our streets? When we went out for Measure G and we developed the factual information around it, one of the things we knew is that even in a good year, which we know we're not in now, Measure G was estimated to bring $4 million a year. And even if all of that went to streets, it would not solve our problem. I believe the number is, depending on if we were going to do it in a 5 or 10 year horizon, it was somewhere between, we needed $6 or $8 million just to bring our streets to an 80% PCI where we needed them. And so one of the things that we were very factual about, and I think we need to constantly remind the public of, is that Measure G, even if 100% of it went to the roads, would not solve the road problem. We're at a point to where $4 million a year additional is not enough. And Measure G will potentially go to other things, roads plus. And so I think it's important to know that. We have a fiscal sustainability issue, and it's going to take a multi-pronged, multi-year solution to get to where we need to be for roads and other items. I do want to turn it to the Public Works Director to address the points specifically on this item.
Sure. Good afternoon. Good evening, actually. Honorable Mayor, members of the City Council. Regards to the selection of streets, the city actually uses a program, a software called Street Savers, and to select the streets. And the program actually provides an output of what the recommendations are. So, staff don't arbitrarily go ahead and select, certain streets within the street network to be able to repave or resurface. We rely on this software, which is similar to what other agencies do, up and down the peninsula, as well as in the East Bay. And so we have both the reconstruction project and as well as this preventative maintenance. As the Councilmember Medina mentioned, this is for prevention of some of these good streets to prevent them from failing, because we just can't go ahead and spend more money to reconstruct these streets in the future, because we have, these are like somewhat like a cheaper way of providing some treatment so that these good streets don't end up failing in the future. So, or else we'll end up spending more money to reconstruct these streets in the future. So it is, this is a project Councilmember Davis mentioned or inquired how many miles of this right now on the list of streets. I don't have that number on top of my head. We, as mentioned in the staff report, there's a total of 89 center miles within our street network. I don't know what the percentage is in relation to this project is, in relation to the total lane miles. So yeah, it is very expensive, you know. And previously, when I first started in San Bruno here, we were only budgeting $800,000 a year in the in the paving program, and which was a drop in the bucket, and to be able to do what we need to do. And as city manager mentioned, there is a need of about $8 million a year in order to get that PCI up to 80 if we wanted to. The last deferred the last evaluation that we did to look at how much the entire need, there's a backlog of, if we only do certain streets a year, these deferred maintenance costs will start to escalate. Is in the order of $40-something million in the next 10 years if we don't do anything in these for these streets. So funding is an issue, and I know Measure G is also there, but as city manager mentioned, it's just not enough to be able to go around to be able to do everything that we want to do with these streets in our city.
Thank you, Jimmy.
Thank you.
Linda.
Yeah, so I don't know if it's just me, but I'm kind of new to the different phases and levels of the street repair. So first, I'd like to ask if the council agrees for just a future report on where we are with street repairs, and then the different, I guess the different, like you said, slurry, and then I think at one of the last meetings we talked about repaving, and then there's like a whole different term, I believe, when you're redoing the entire street. And so I think it would be great, because this was a pretty, I think people are quite vocal about having their streets repaired, and it would be great just to have, I don't want to take too much time, but a really brief report on the different levels of street repair. And then it sounds like the work's already been done around where the streets fall within those levels. So like how many streets are within, they need a total repavement, how many streets fall within the slurry. And maybe we can just start there, because I agree with Councilmember Davis that we really do need to have plans for these larger initiatives. And then I'm looking at my map right now trying to remember a street, and I believe it was 7th Avenue. That was just, that street just desperately needs to be redone. And I'm wondering if we're better off using the term slurrying these streets that may be in better condition versus saving that cost for 2 years and redoing an entire street that has never been redone. So I'm not sure what your thoughts are on that. It's just, I know that there were some streets that I just thought were in such horrible condition.
Sure.
City manager.
Sure. Why don't I take the beginning of that? Linda, one of the things we do every year during our capital budgeting process that is coming up is we talk about all of the streets that we're planning to address that year with the budget, within the budgeted resources that we have. And we talk about the various treatment types: slurry seal, grind and overlay, complete reconstruction. And so as we begin the capital budgeting process for the upcoming fiscal year FY 2021, we will certainly have that conversation and give the city council a full overview of the different treatment types and why we're planning what we're planning. I think to your latter question about would we potentially be better off with not slurry sealing these streets and going forward with maybe a street that is more further degraded. One of the things that the Street Saver program does, and that's the program that Director Tan mentioned, is that it takes a look at the PCI of all of our roads, and it does the calculation based on where is the most appropriate place for you to utilize your limited dollars. And actually, sometimes that works out to be slurry sealing the road that is in, let's say, moderate condition is actually more cost effective because you want to protect that road, and you may not have enough money to address that road that is very significantly degraded, and that could potentially be exponentially more. And so when you have limited resources, sometimes the program and decisions are made to slurry seal roads to protect them so they do not degrade further, because a fully degraded road is, let's say, not getting a lot more worse, waiting another 6 months or another year, but it's important to protect the integrity of a road that has started to develop that alligator cracking and have a penetration in the surface, because you do not want the water to penetrate down and further degrade the subbase. And so all of that is taken into account with the engineers when these recommendations and funding allocations are made.
Linda, is that?
Sorry, I had to unmute. So I think just, I guess talking this out a little bit, if you have roads, and I don't know because I don't have the dates of when a road was last repaved or last slurried, but would there be any concerns around there being an imbalance? Because that, like, let's say that East Side or the avenues, I'll just say maybe if they've never been repaved and versus parts of San Bruno, even where I'm in Huntington Park, where there has been, you know, it appears that work has been done in our streets, which came out very nice. But my concern is that if the streets, like in the avenues, are in such bad condition that they're not going to have their turn because we're spending all of our money trying to just keep these other streets from getting in worse condition. So I guess I'm just trying to balance out when will there be a balance of everyone having their streets redone? Is that being considered? Does that make sense? Should I rephrase the question?
Considered when we do the capital budgeting process and when we look at where can we best utilize the dollars we have. And Director Tan, you can probably articulate a little bit of sort of the exponential costs when you're looking at road reconstruction. For example, this is a project at about $500,000. When you really look at reconstructing a roadway, you're of any significant length, you're talking about a lot more than $500,000. Director Tan.
Yeah, so a while back ago, street paving is always, I guess, a hot topic, right? Because a lot of people, do feel that their streets, it needs to be paved. The city actually has done a study session with the council a while back ago too. And maybe that's something that is worthwhile doing to kind of share some of our information in regards to when these streets need to be, the graphs showing when the preventative maintenance should be performed and overall cost of reconstruction, rehabilitation, and slurry seal. Because, if you go down the line, there's 3 different treatments, right? The preventive maintenance is the most cheapest, which is this slurry seal. It can cover, with the $500,000, it could cover multiple miles, many miles, within the city. But if you're going to do reconstruction, where you have to dig into the base layer of the streets, it tends to cost a lot more. So maybe a block 1,000 feet could be about as high as $300,000 or $400,000, to do that. But if you're doing just the mill and fill, it could be maybe half as that for 1,000 feet. So we do have those estimated numbers, and then there's we have all these presentation slides that we prepared for on previous study sessions that we can share with the council again to let you know what we've done. So recently we came back, I think last council meeting, we came to council for the SB1 funding. And that was, a subcommittee was derived, in order for us to use the SB1 money for these failed street locations, because that's what the subcommittee wanted to do, because those failed streets cost a lot of money to reconstruct, because you can't really just take your $800,000 or $1 million or whatever the money that you have and just focus on the failed streets. Because what happens is that then your good street will end up failing, and because there are potentially a lot more percentage of good streets within the city that will potentially start to fail, then you'll never catch up to be able to go ahead and start reconstructing because the cost of reconstruction is just exponentially really a lot higher than preventative maintenance. So we're always trying to try to do preventive maintenance to try to make sure that these good streets don't end up failing at a faster rate, and then so we can always take whatever the money that's left over to be able to focus on other streets within the street network.
Right, but I don't. So I don't. I appreciate the answer, but I'm sorry. I don't feel that there was an answer given. I want to make sure that when we're balancing the amounts of the repaving that's occurring, which I respect that and understand what you're saying, that there, you know, preventative maintenance is crucial to not having to expend even more money at a later time. I guess my question though is, when you look at certain streets, like even off Rosewood, I remember seeing this little portion of the street that just has holes all over it, right? I mean, that would, I'm guessing that would probably need to be repaved. It wouldn't need to be slurried. But if we're spending all of our money on the preventative maintenance, and that means that in and of itself, we're really only focusing on the areas that essentially are already in pretty good condition. Whereas you have streets that I was told by many people, since the time they moved in, they've never had their street repaved. So I guess my question going back is, when you're saying we'll put some money aside of whatever's left over, I don't know that whatever's left over will ever be enough to really truly initiate repaving certain streets that have never been repaved. And so I guess my question is really like, how do you get to that, to the streets that truly need to be repaved so that they can be part of the preventative maintenance program in the next 15 years, right? I get this is a very long-term plan, but I want to make sure that everyone's going to get to have nice streets at some point.
Jimmy, let me take that. Linda, I think the best way to do that is through more funding. And when we educated the community around Measure G, one of the sort of unfortunate statistics out there is that many of our roads had not had a major reconstruction in the last 30 years. And that is a sad fact based on the amount of funding that we have in total to go to road maintenance. And road maintenance is one thing where you sort of every year have to do a little bit of both. You have to do a little bit of protecting the streets that just need a slurry seal so they don't get worse. And you have to do a full reconstruction on that. That is exponentially more expensive. And you have to do some road reconstruction. And I think when we talk project by project, it is very easy to say, why are we doing this slurry seal versus not doing construction? The best way to have that conversation is when we look at the totality of our capital improvement program during our annual budgeting process, because every year we do a little bit of both. And generally every city does a little bit of both because you really want to. If you only focused on all of your money on reconstruction of failed roads, your total backlog and your total financial burden would increase, because you need to do some protection of those roads that really just need a slurry seal to stop the water penetration. And so it's a very complicated process that has gone through, and there's a lot of data that backs up all of the recommendation of how we do the treatment. I think the unfortunate answer is the reason why we have a PCI in the 60s and most of our streets having not had a major road repair in the last 30 years is, unfortunately, as a city, we have not had the money to devote significant sums to paving reconstruction. And that has a position now where we need approximately $8 million a year just to get our average PCI to 80. And that's on a 0 to 100 scale. And with Measure, we have 4 million.
Okay, and so that'll come to us and at a later time to see what that balance is.
Absolutely.
Okay, thank you.
Marty?
Yeah, I can tell my colleagues here that it is a funding problem. When I first got on the council, I believe the number was 3 million a year to get us up to a respectable PCI. And I'm in support of this project specifically. I think it's a good practice to spend money to do the preventive maintenance. Clearly throughout San Bruno, there's dozens of streets that could be redone that are in horrible shape. The city is proceeding with replacing pavement as we replace the water and the sewer on the east side of town currently. that takes time, and that takes a lot of money. My question regarding the Marisol is that if they're in that contingency, if you could see to utilize that, because slurries don't have as big of a unforeseen condition than regular paving when you're milling into the ground and hit a soft spot. These streets are already in a good shape. So if you could find a way to spread that within that full development, so you don't need to come back to it and then do a couple slurry streets, that would be great. I do recommend that we do have a study session on paving, just to advise the public on why it really is a fine balancing act. But if you don't have the funds, which we don't, we can't get, we're barely scratching the surface, right? And that's why I fully supported Measure G. And I'm looking forward to having that discussion of letting our public know this is when you can expect your street to get paved on this level of work product that we're going to be spending every year. So it's tough, but I'm in supporting this project, and it's time to move forward. Thank you.
Just real quick, and Jimmy, please correct me, I forget now, was it SB1 where we received extra revenues, which was determined to go to failed streets specifically?
That's correct.
So just as a SB1, when that came into effect, the subcommittee which went to the council and they all concurred was, hey, let's, those extra monies, which the city was not normally going to receive, let's make sure they're dedicated to those failed streets, not just slurry. So council did take action before for those dollars to go toward that. There was a time before too, as we were getting reimbursed from the trust from the pipeline explosion, that we had $3 million come back for staff time, which is already expended through the normal budget process, which we had $1 million that the council concurred, $1 million each year, which I'd asked it to be diverted to keep our PCI up, which had helped it to maintain. But as Marty has said too, it is costly. There also, and correct me, Director Tan, there's a system in which all the streets are looked at, ranked, and try to figure the dollars. So it's not about one side, the other side. It's kind of more of a global look at the community and to see where it has been. And I know that I had asked in the past that, hey, when we're having these proposed streets to come up, let's also know the last time they were done, some work was done, so that we can kind of also, because if we see it's 5 years before, and then there's other streets that maybe have been decades, then we need to, I think, be mindful of that. So that is something that I think, as city manager said during the CIP, that can come up, bring that forward. We used to have a subcommittee on infrastructure, which we've done away with that. And the reason I thought it was more important, because I think on these critical masses and things that are important to the community, rather than going to a subcommittee trying to get that and having the subcommittee come back to the council, we're all hearing the same information real time and kind of shaving off a layer of bureaucracy and extra meetings. So I think it's important that we're all in this together and that we all have that information, because obviously, no matter where you go in this community, you're going to find somebody who has a street or a concern legitimately that feels that their street should have been next. So I appreciate all the good conversation. If there's nothing else, I don't see hands. I'm going to move on to item H, if that's okay. And that is adopt a resolution authorizing the city manager to execute a grant agreement with California Natural Resources Agency for the award of a general fund specific grant in the amount of $913,333. And the only reason I brought that up was just as a point that this was a grant that was sought after in early 2019 from CCAG. Went through that process, and this city was awarded that grant. And the great news is that there is no local matching funds necessary or required from the city of San Bruno in order to accept this. So that is a big plus for San Bruno and an asset to have. And I want to thank staff for their efforts, because obviously they did the work. If there's nothing else on our consent, we do have items F, G, and H. Is there any action?
Through the chair,
Yes.
I'll make a motion to approve those, but also wanted to just say there was a question about where people could find out about where their streets are. And
Yes,
if they go to the city's website and just if they search on City of San Bruno PCI, there is information that's been updated as of March of 2020 that shows the ranking of all the streets in the city. And so if people think their streets are bad, they can always go there and see how much worse some of the other streets are. My street is on the failed list, just by the way. But with that, I will introduce the remaining items for approval.
I'll second.
Motion by Salazar, seconded by Davis to approve remainder of consent. Melissa, can you take roll?
Councilmember Davis,
Yes.
Councilmember Mason,
Yes.
Councilmember Medina,
Yes.
Vice Mayor Salazar,
Yes.
Mayor Medina.
Aye, yes.
Motion carries.
What I want to do is with council.
Mayor, I'm sorry, before you move on, I meant to say something for consent. We already approved it, but it's just actually if Melissa would be willing to clarify in the minutes, if I may, on March 10th, there was no mention that the council did not approve the $45,000 contract, which was part of the title. I think it just says something like the council agreed to move forward with like the intent. But I think it should be clear, since it was part of the resolution, that the council did not agree to award the $45,000 contract to the consulting company. So I'm not sure what the process would be, but I would just say if the record could reflect that in the minutes.
I don't mind reflecting it to indicate that the $45,000 contract with, I forget the company name, but National Demographics or something like that, that it did not go through on March 10th.
Okay, great. Thank you.
No problem.
The contract itself was not correct.
Right. The contract itself was not adopted that night.
Right.
Okay.
Okay, thank you.
Let's proceed on. What I'd like to do is, with council's indulgence, I'd like to just go ahead and open up for public comment. I'd like to call on Mr. Seymour, and if there are any other persons that had wanted to speak, and I have the list of who was there at the beginning, but that wanted to speak, if you could raise your hand. But Mr. Seymour, appreciate your patience, and we'll go ahead and open up the mic for you, and if you can unmute yourself, and please go ahead.
Thank you, Mayor Medina. I really appreciate it. And I'm sorry that I couldn't speak earlier in the meeting, but it took me a long time to get on tonight. Can you guys hear me?
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Okay, because my screen just changed. All right. I just wanted to let everyone know that in this pandemic, there is a group, and for those listening, called Marinship Emergency Medical Manufacturing Group. And we're working with this group, and they're providing PPE free of charge to cities, police departments, fire departments, hospitals, frontline workers, people in grocery stores. So Marinship Emergency Medical Manufacturing Group, it's a Facebook page. We have filled more than 5,000 orders over the last 10 days. And we've got another 4,000 or 5,000 orders that we'll fill over the next 10 days. So there's room. These are face shields that protect you over your mask. And I'd like to just share a small story. Today we delivered a number of these masks to an anesthesiologist who is on the front lines, her job is to put people to sleep when they can no longer breathe. And it was a very emotional meeting with her, but we delivered 200 of these to her. We've been delivering them to, today we have orders for Kaiser. We delivered orders to Palo Alto Medical Foundation, and tomorrow we'll be delivering some to our fire department. We've been delivering them to fire departments throughout the Bay Area. And I just want people to know that this group exists. It's a group of companies that are located in Sausalito, and they've turned over their manufacturing to manufacturing PPE. All of this is being delivered and made free of charge. If you go to this Facebook site, there's an order form, and there's also a form where you can donate, because this is costing a lot. We're shipping throughout the country, FedEx, and it's a lot of us are extending not only our personal time but also our money to do this. And so I just wanted to share that. I want people to know that there are groups out there like us who are trying to fill the void. And again, it's Marin Ship Emergency Medical Manufacturing Group. It's a Facebook page. If you could go onto that page, if you are a medical facility, a fire department, a police department, and then also Laura, we have your shields, but maybe you could call me so that we could figure out exactly where to deliver them. That would be great. Thank you very much.
Thank you for sharing that, Stephen, and thanks for your patience. Is there any, I don't see any other hands at this time. And so at this point, we're going to close out public comment, and we're going to go back to the agenda. And Melissa, I just want to confirm, correct?
Correct.
Okay. So council, let's go ahead and move back to the agenda to conduct of business, item 7.
Item 7A, review and provide direction regarding Title V nuisances of the San Bruno Municipal Code.
City Attorney Zapparano.
Thank you. We're going to take just a minute to get the PowerPoint up, so please bear with us. All right, can everybody see the presentation and hear me?
I can.
Yep.
Looks good.
Yes?
Yes.
All right. So tonight we're going to take a couple of minutes and look through Title V, which is part of the city's municipal code revision process. And our agenda tonight is we're going to go over just a bit of a background. We're going to discuss the policy issues around Title V and request some direction from all of you, and then go over next steps. So here's the background. You've seen this before for our prior municipal code amendments. And so we started this process in late 2018. And the primary focus for the City Council was to review these chapters of the municipal code for internal consistency and to make sure they're consistent with current law. And in addition to that, the City Council has also had a policy discussion for those required revisions about a number of provisions in each of those chapters. So for example, in October of 2018, we looked at Title I and Title II. There were a number of policy changes in both of those titles. And then we, the Quality Code Publishing, which is our code publishing company, completed their review of the municipal code and made a variety of recommendations. So then in November, the City Council adopted revisions to Title I and Title II. And then in July, there was a discussion of Title II and the rest of Title III, again, with some policy direction on a couple of key items. And then finally, most recently, last month, you adopted revisions to Title IV, licenses and regulations. And again, also there were a number of policy revisions for consistency with state law and issues, for example, such as vending in city parks. So that's where we've been. And this slide shows where we're going tonight and in the next couple of meetings. So Title V has 8 chapters, and the title of the title is Nuisances. So this is an important chapter, and we want to make sure that we go through any and all of your questions that you have about it before we bring it back. So these 8 chapters have to do with what's a nuisance, talking about enforcement, and then talking about particular kinds of nuisances like weeds, graffiti, unruly gatherings, alcoholic beverage sales for businesses that have already been approved, maintenance of distressed properties, and then finally registration of foreclosed and abandoned properties. So all of these things are part of Title V, which is what the city does to regulate basically the look and feel of the community. So this is an important chapter, and there are a number of policy questions that we're going to go over tonight. And before we do that, I want to just give you a very brief preview of what we're going to be focusing on. So we'll mostly focus on chapter 5.04, which is the definition of a nuisance. And so the important thing here is we want to look to make sure that this section is consistent with a newly amended zoning ordinance regarding parking. So we'll spend a few minutes talking about that. I want to make sure that we take a pause to discuss any other desired amendments about parking. And this is, by the way, on private property, not on public property, because that's what nuisances are addressing on private property. And then finally, we want to take some time to discuss any new provisions about other topics that maybe aren't currently covered in the chapter. So let's take just a minute and review the chapters where we're proposing only minor amendments. There are some of those in 5.08, which is enforcement, nuisance abatement, and cost recovery. There are some in 5.16 regarding graffiti, and some in 5.22 regarding alcoholic beverage sales. And all of those are addressed in more detail in the staff report. I'm not going to go over them in detail right now, but I'd be happy to answer any questions about them. So if we go back to nuisances in general, and I think it's important, this was in the staff report, but I want to display the entire portion of the staff report because I think it's important for the City Council and the public to understand that Title V has really been proved to be both comprehensive and sufficient to address by code many, if not virtually all, of the code enforcement issues in the city. And somebody might say, well, that's surprising because we still have code enforcement issues in the city. How can that possibly be? And the answer is because difficult code enforcement cases are usually not the result of inadequate ordinances. We are going to talk about some potential changes to the ordinance tonight, but for the most part, you'll see if you read through the ordinance carefully, as both the staff did in our preparation and as I did as well, that most of the nuisance conditions are covered in the ordinance. Why is code enforcement often so difficult? And there are a few reasons for that. The first thing is to understand the distinction between a public and a private nuisance. And I have that definition in the staff report. And I just want to indicate that the city and in its nuisance ordinance, that's designed to address public nuisances. Private nuisances are those things that might affect one neighbor to another, but don't affect the entire neighborhood or the entire community. That's the definition in the civil code. It's section 3480. So for public nuisance, you need the neighborhood, you need a considerable number of persons. That's what the code says. So that's different than a private nuisance, which might be one neighbor might be complaining about what another neighbor is doing on their property. There might be somebody who's passing through the neighborhood and might see something that they might consider to be a nuisance to them, but the neighborhood isn't complaining about it. So that's the distinction. And generally, what the city allocates its resources to are dealing with public nuisances because that's what taxpayer dollars should go to, is addressing public nuisances, not private disputes between individuals. Another reason why code enforcement is often challenging is because some of the violations that are most difficult are transitory. So these are things that the person might be complaining about it, and it might be a valid complaint, but then by the time the code enforcement officer shows up, it's not there anymore. So those are difficult to deal with because in order to prosecute a code enforcement case, the staff has to personally either observe or confirm the violation. And you would see that if we took the residents' word for it, which of course we believe them, but if that's all we had, that's not really going to hold up in a court to justify a city sanction against somebody where the only testimony is somebody else says that they heard or saw it. Another reason why code enforcement is sometimes difficult is violations might be hard to confirm. So a good example of this is individuals who might be operating a business out of their home, either without a business license or without a permit from the Community Development Department. The only way to confirm that is to go into the house, get consent to do that, and basically search the premises for evidence of a business. So those are very difficult violations to confirm. And then finally, and this is, I think, what occurs most often, is residents who are engaging in behavior that might violate our code can be resistant. And they can be resistant to changing their behavior, even if there's a sanction imposed, like a fine, and often irrespective of what the amount of the fine is. So why is that? Why don't most people just follow the rules? And one reason is that there might be circumstances outside of their control that they can't do anything about. Another reason is there might be a dispute between neighbors that kind of underlies the issue. It's not really the nuisance, but it's something else. And so if you don't resolve that underlying issue, you're not going to ever resolve the nuisance. Another common reason why these things are difficult to rectify is it's expensive. So for example, if you're telling somebody they have to take down, half of their house, or they have to take down a shed they've built that they're storing their tools in, these are expenses that the property owner will want to avoid incurring. And then finally, related to that, there's some advantage to the property owner to retaining the condition. Sometimes it's an economic advantage, but sometimes there are other advantages that are non-economic. And so these are things, for example, where a property owner, we had a code enforcement case some years ago, in which there was the property was very distressed. The property owner didn't do anything about the property, but we found out the reason was there was a disturbing event that occurred in the property to the property owner, and they really couldn't go back there. So they just let it fall into disrepair. So once we found that out, we were able to work with the property owner to list the property, and it was eventually rectified. So these are all reasons why some code enforcement cases are difficult. So with that background, what did we do before embarking on a proposed revision of Chapter 5? Well, the first stop was the Community Development Department in requesting staff input. And what we asked staff is, what's missing from the code? What do you wish you had in the code to deal with nuisance conditions that you have seen out in the field, where you would say to yourself, gosh, if only the code said X, then we could address this. That was the question we asked staff. So staff came up with a couple of things. Surprisingly, not very many. That was interesting. I thought maybe there might be more, but there weren't. There were only a few. And the first thing they mentioned was parking. And I think this is an interest of the community and an interest of the city council. So let's spend a couple of minutes talking about how the issues surrounding parking are relating to Title 12. So here's the challenge with parking and parking on private property. And I usually don't like to read my slides, but let me read this one because I think this is important that we all are on the same footing. So the challenge with addressing parking on private property is that in some neighborhoods, the built environment is really not adequate to accommodate the number and types of operable and inoperable vehicles that residents own and operate in those neighborhoods. That's what a number of years of research and data and analysis has uncovered. And that's a very difficult problem for cities to solve because we can't really change the built environment very easily, and we can't make residents change the built environment. It's really not the public realm. So that's our challenge with parking. And I think once articulated, I think we'll all realize that this really satisfies all of the criteria in the last slide for a difficult code enforcement matter. You know, there's an advantage to the property owner to having the cars parked on his or her property. It's expensive to either register them or to get rid of them or to store them somewhere. There's reasons why they want to have the car close by. They don't want to have it far away. Might be circumstances outside of their control. For example, they might be living with a number of people in the household. And so therefore, those people might have vehicles. So there's all kinds of things that make parking on or dealing with parking on private property a real challenge. So what has the city done in response to community interest in parking? Well, they've done three things. The first thing the city council did is it adopted a residential permit parking program. And the purpose of that, one of the purposes, was to limit overcrowding in the street. So in other words, the theory was, we don't want to have these cars competing for scarce parking spaces on the street. Let's have the neighborhood agree, if they wish, to have a permit parking program to limit the number of cars that are parked on the public street. So that way, when you come home from work or in the evening or whatever, or come home in the morning, you have a place to park, or at least a larger opportunity to find a place to park. So that was the first thing that the city council did in response to community interest. The second thing the city did was did additional periodic enforcement for violations on streets in different neighborhoods, and in those neighborhoods which are particularly impacted. And so the city council is aware that there was a campaign, a number of them by the police department, to enforce on public streets, parking in driveways, parking on the sidewalk, and so on. So that was done for a period of time. And then the final thing the city council just recently did is they adopted new zoning regulations that allow or incentivize or make easier the creation of additional off-street parking on non-conforming private property. Okay, well, what does that mean? What that means is that if you have a property that has a substandard garage, or maybe only a one-car garage, and maybe the car doesn't even fit in the garage, or a driveway that is substandard, it's not long enough, so you can hardly park a car in it. It allowed a variety of options for residents to, if they wished, to modify their property in certain ways so they could park more of their vehicles on their private property, thus getting them off of the street. So those are the three things that the city council did. Now, it's important to note that the purpose of the zoning code is really to address required parking for residential uses. The zoning code is, which is chapter 12, title 12, is not a mechanism to determine whether we should or shouldn't have certain kinds of vehicles or certain kinds of personal property, or whether it's a public nuisance to display those things on private property. All the zoning code does is says, if you have a private property, you have to have a certain amount of required parking. And in cases where your neighborhood is impacted or your property is impacted, the city is going to make it easier for you to park vehicles of whatever type they might be on your property so that they can be gotten off the street. That was the reason for the zoning code. Conversely, Title V, which is what we're dealing with tonight, only addresses conditions that are a public nuisance. So Title V doesn't talk about if you own a single family home, how many off-street parking spaces do you need? What Title V talks about is if you own a single family home, we really don't want you to be putting ugly things out on the driveway. So let's talk about what those things are under the current definition in Title V. So under the zoning code that the city council just adopted, what's allowed? Well, I'm going to display a couple of these things at the same time. So under the zoning code for your required parking, you can park a motor vehicle, an operable motor vehicle, on a garage apron, so that's the section in front of the garage, a driveway, or in an adjacent side yard with certain conditions. So that's what you can do if you own one of these substandard properties with a short driveway or a too small garage. And motor vehicles, for purpose of the zoning ordinance, does include a trailer on which an RV is stored. So for example, in your driveway, you can have a motor vehicle like a Honda Civic, and then right next to it, you can have a trailer with a camper on it, for example. And the reason for this rule is because the city has determined that we'd rather have your trailer with a camper on it on your private property as opposed to on the street, taking up 1.5 or 2 parking spaces. Regarding inoperable vehicles, the zoning code is pretty clear. It says you can't park them in the visible front or side yards. So no inoperable vehicles if they're visible in the front and side yards. All right, what does Title V in comparison allow? All right, well, operable vehicles, you can park a boat, a trailer, a camper, or an RV. Only one of those things in the garage. That's fine. We don't care what you park in your garage particularly because you can't see it. or on a city-approved driveway. Well, that's consistent with the zoning code, as you can see, because again, you can have your Honda Civic and right next to it, your boat on a trailer. That's okay under the zoning code, and it's also okay under Title V. What does Title V say about inoperable vehicles? Well, again, similarly to the zoning code, if they're in your front or side yard, we don't want to see them. They have to be either screened or otherwise allowed by the zoning code. Well, they're not allowed in the zoning code, so there you are. So again, both the amended zoning code that the City Council adopted recently and the current version of Title V are pretty consistent. So what did staff identify as a potential issue for parking on private property? And the first thing that we came up with is we said, well, Title V says you can have one of those things, boats, trailers. Sorry, I have to flip my screen over here, campers or RVs. You can have one of those. Well, it's within the City Council's policy discretion to change that if they want to. They could say you could have none of those. You can't park any of those on private property. Or they could say, you know what, you can park 2 of them on private property or more. Because if we don't let you park 2 on private property, well, you're going to park it on the street, and that might be an issue. So that's one policy question for the City Council. The second policy question is you could decide that the prohibitions for inoperable vehicles aren't quite strong enough. And you could say, you know what, we don't like the look of these inoperable vehicles, and we like them so little that we don't want any of them parked anywhere on your property where it's visible, even if it's screened. So even if you have a fence around it or it's behind a gate in your side yard, if you can see that, whether you can see it or not, we don't want you to park it on your property. So immediately you'll notice that we have a difficulty with enforcement on that. Because if somebody decides to violate that code, which they very well might, then a warrant might be required to get into private property if it's covered or screened. So that would be a very difficult thing to prohibit. And that's the reason why the code currently says we prohibit inoperable vehicles, but if they're screened, then you can put them there. And we don't want to be going behind those screens without a warrant. So those are the possible, really the 2 issues that came up when we were reviewing the code as to possible changes the City Council could make. Either change the number of allowed boats, trailers, campers, or RVs from 1 to something different, or prohibit any inoperable vehicle parking. But again, there's some enforcement problems with that. So related to this, and sort of the final topic in parking, has to do with the question of, we'll just call them tarps or coverings. And this has come up on a number of occasions. So the question is to cover or not to cover. And the reason why that's a question is because the city actually can't uncover vehicles on parking property without a warrant to determine just if they're operable or if they have a current registration. So that's the conundrum. And I suppose it's possible that people in the community may have differing views about what's less attractive. Some people might say, well, you know, if you have that old inoperable car that you've always been waiting to work on, frankly, it's a good looking car. I'd rather look at that than a tarp. But other folks might have the opposite opinion. They might rather look at a tarp than your old inoperable jalopy that you're never going to get to. So the difficulty, there's a couple of difficulties with saying we're going to prohibit tarps to cover vehicles on private property, but it is a policy option for the City Council and we could certainly explore it. So that concludes the parking topics that we think are worthy of some discussion under the Title V of the code. But there are just a couple of other things that you might want to consider. One of the suggestions that our staff made, which we thought was a great idea, is to prohibit feeding of wild animals. And this has become a public nuisance in some areas, especially the downtown, where you have individuals that may be associated with some businesses feeding pigeons, and they create a public nuisance. So that's something that I think the council should definitely consider exploring. The other thing that staff recommended, both building department and code enforcement, is some wording amendments throughout the code to conform with state law, and those are reflected in the draft that's attached to your staff report. And unless you have questions about them, I'm not going to go over them in detail right now. So what are the next steps is we're looking for some direction, and particularly on those two issues, parking and tarps. And then we would be ready to introduce and adopt amendments at a subsequent meeting. And the schedule at the moment anyway remains on track to complete all 11 chapters, hopefully by 2021. If we complete chapter 5 in the next month or two, we'll be a little less than half done, and the other chapters should come in due course. So that concludes my presentation, and I'd be happy to answer any questions. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Mark.
Thank you, Mark, for the presentation, and for the public as well. It's also that one of the things the council had tasked the city attorney was going through each of the chapters in the municipal code, and again, reviewing them, bringing them up to date, making sure they're consistent with the other chapters, and so they all flow and are in sync. And I appreciate that. Do we have any questions of Mark's on specifics to his presentation that he gave? Get the hands up there. Well, I think a lot of us probably have comments. So why don't I go circle? Why don't I start? Well, I see Linda has her hand up, and then I'll just call on each person because I think everybody may have something, right? So first we'll go to Linda.
Yeah, I have a question, and then I guess then you're gonna do public comment, I guess. But my question, Mark, is I guess it would help to have numbers. So I appreciate you bringing this to us because I know it's been an issue that has come up. But one thing I don't know is how many complaints you get about each area. So for example, like the trailers, people who have boats, I am not aware of the extent of the concerns. And I think it would help drive the policy decision to know how many complaints are we getting to enact a new policy. I'm not sure if you know, but that's one of the questions that I have.
Well, that's a good question. Sorry, we're having an audio difficulty. That's a good question. I don't actually get any complaints. Those complaints all go to the code enforcement department, and they're tracked and logged. So I don't have an answer to that, but it was apparently enough of them, or complaints were sufficiently persistent that the code enforcement officers sort of put this on their list as something that they're that they occasionally, or at least more than occasionally, encounter. So we can certainly provide some sort of breakdown of that information, perhaps at a separate session regarding the operations of code enforcement. But I understand you make a good point in that it'd be interesting to know what the data is before sort of deciding what, a policy decision. What I can tell you is that in past years, before I got to the city, actually, I had heard that there was an effort to reduce or eliminate the number of RVs parked on private property, and that was met with, I will just say, a great deal of community consternation. Some of the council members may know about that, and so that's, I'm speculating, but that's probably the reason why Title V says you can have one of them.
Okay, yeah, that's will this be like the chapter 4 where you say where you're going to bring this back? This is just an introduction, and then you bring it back again for more comments, and then I think it comes back the third time for a vote.
This is information.
I'm looking for any direction the city council has tonight. And then at the next meeting, we would bring the ordinance back for introduction. That's another opportunity for the public and the city council to comment on the ordinance. And then if there are comments, we could bring it back again if there are major revisions, or if minor revisions, those revisions can be made, at the time, and it can be brought back for adoption. But there's at least 2 more meetings to answer your question.
Okay, so Mayor Medina, I'm not sure if you want to just limit questions to the items that City Attorney Zafrano is proposing for now and then public comment, or do you want me to ask all my questions now?
Well, what I thought is maybe we do any quick questions. I'm seeing that we do have one member of the public that wishes to speak. So, you know,
Okay.
I'm free to do it. If we want, we can take the member of the public, if that's okay. And then we can come back to us. And then Linda, I can start back with you and then we'll just go down the list. Is that all right?
Perfect, thank you.
Okay. All right, so go. I'm seeing one hand up. And I'm seeing Mr. Stephen Seymour. If I think you can go ahead. I think you're unmuted. And why don't you give it a test, see if we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
We can hear you perfect. We'll just get Melissa to get ready. And when you're ready, go ahead, sir.
That's those 3 minutes. All right, thank you. I just want to say that I think parking in people's front yards leads to blight. And the fact that our city would even consider such a thing is a problem for me. We have all sorts of other mitigation issues that we could take into consideration, and that is through the permitting process. Unfortunately, the permitting process that we have right now is very cumbersome, but there are many cities who have permitting processes that would allow us to ensure that people don't basically collect cars. And the only reason people would have to park in their front lawn is to collect cars. And any city that wants to decide to say that it's okay in their city ordinance to park cars on their front lawn is a city that, I don't know, I'm really concerned with. I happen to live in that city who's, if I understand this correctly, is considering that option, and I don't think that's an option that we should consider. I think that San Bruno lends itself to a city that should be basically put higher on a pedestal. We're right next to the San Francisco airport. There are, and another thing, I mean, it's an eyesore to see people parking on their front lawns. So I think that we can do much better than this. I realize that we have small driveways, we have parking constraints, but I think that we need to consider issues that will resolve this other than saying, okay, it's okay to put a car or more on your front line if in the front of your yard if it's close to your driveway. I just don't, I have to tell you, I'm a little aghast at this particular option. It doesn't seem right. And if you can do it down here, for those of you who are up on the hill, if you can do it down here, if we make this something that's okay, and it alleviates some of the pressure on I hate to say this because I don't like to divide the city. I think that, and I'm not trying to divide the city, I think that we are living in different neighborhoods, and our neighborhood on the east side is more congested than on the west side. But if it can happen here, then it can happen all throughout the city. And I don't think that's something that we want in San Bruno. And if we have staff and legal who are trying to push this through, I think you should consider whether or not they should be the staff and legal that you hold and have, because there are others who would protect our communities. And I know that my wife wants to talk, so maybe we could reset the clock.
Hold on, Sandra. Good. Just
thank you.
Hold on. Okay, please.
Okay, I think just with the lawn issue, I think we're really coming at this from a defeatist point of view. It's like we're almost looking like how not to do things better, just kind of throwing our arms up in the air. And, you know, we've heard before that it's the culture of the neighborhood. Well, if you do any less enforcing than you're doing now, our culture is going to get a lot worse. And I just can't believe that's an option. But anyway, you did talk about there are areas where cars are parked in their driveway for years and the neighbors don't complain. So, you know, it should only be considered if it's within the neighborhood. Well, a lot of people are very, very uncomfortable to call on their neighbor. So what they do, they call someone else from outside the neighborhood and have them call in, because unfortunately, too often we've heard that code enforcement might have told them who called, being their neighbors, and they stopped calling 10, 20, 30 years ago. They don't feel safe about it. So that's one thing to consider. Another thing to consider is the only reason we're here thinking about parking on lawns is because we haven't been consistent. We have not been consistent in enforcing the rules. And I just really think we could do a lot better. And when it comes down to it, I have a small driveway, so I have the luxury of being able to get a car that fits within that. And we went down from 2 cars to 1. It's working out great. But I wouldn't go out and buy a Ford pickup and think that that was going to be okay just to block my whole sidewalk for my neighbors to get around. So I think that's a personal situation, and I think every resident needs to see how they can comply to the law. I think that's where the burden is. It's on me to follow the regulations. And, if I was holding on to somebody's junker for 20 years, I think the city should have the right to say, you know what, you're bringing this neighborhood down. And also in the long run, we don't know what tomorrow holds, but if people are parking on their lawns, my house value is going to go down. As it is, we've already confirmed earlier today that we're at the bottom of the list for getting our streets fixed. So we have broken down streets. We have cars blocking sidewalks. You add a car to lawns, I don't know that this is a place I would want to consider living in possibly. It just, the standard keeps dropping. Instead of trying to keep it up and plan and be proactive, the bar gets lower and lower. And we could do a hell of a lot better than this. Thank you.
Thank you. I see one other hand up, and that is Tim. Tim, if you can unmute yourself. There you go, Tim. You've been unmuted, and the clock will start when you begin.
Good evening, Mayor,
Good evening,
Council, and everybody else out there. I have a concern about boats and RVs within the neighborhoods. They should not be allowed to park. And I know other cities have ordinances that don't allow these in the neighborhoods, especially where I live, where our family lives, and some of our friends live. They're very impacted when a boat, RV is parked in the neighborhood. And they only use these vehicles, do not move, because they're recreational vehicles, they're seasonal vehicles. They're only used maybe 2 or 3 months out of the whole year. So that is a very big concern. And plus, and then Huntington Avenue between, we'll say Florida and San Felipe. There are people like to park their boats there and let them sit there for weeks, for months. And there's no enforcement on that at all, unless somebody calls it in. So I would like to see, and that's impacting the neighborhood too. Everybody uses that area to park, that lives on that strip of road. So I would like to see that, cleaned up and enforced, and also to reiterate, blocking the sidewalks, and that is a big issue regarding blocking the sidewalk for pedestrians. Have the right of way. That's what the sidewalks are made for. People have in strollers have difficulties getting around. It's a safety issue. They have to go into the street to get around the vehicle. So that is another concern, and I'd like to see better enforcement that change the culture of the city. I know it's not easy to do, but I would like to see that changed and see a better improvement in our neighborhoods. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Tim. I'm seeing no other hands. Unless the city clerk sees something I don't, then we're going to go ahead and end any public comment and bring it back to council. As we bring it back to council, I just want to clarify for all of us, is that in reading the staff report, I did not see, or unless I overlooked it, my colleagues can correct me, that it was proposing for somebody to park on their lawn in the front. So I'm going to ask the city attorney to, and I'm sorry, colleagues, I just kind of want to address that because that's not what I kind of was reading. So I want to make that clear. I also want to make clear the process. This process is for guidance, and this process is for feedback from council. So our legal counsel or our city manager does not make policy, the council does, but they do have to bring it to us after getting staff's input and give us what they know, and we give them direction to how we want to see it molded. So to feel that somebody is pushing their desire on us, I don't think is fair to us or fair to the others, because really we're here giving that direction, and that's what they've come to. And so what we direct will be drafted. City attorney.
Yes, Mr. Mayor, thank you. So, gosh, I sure hope I didn't give anybody the impression that either the staff report or the presentation or the PowerPoint or anything that staff is suggesting suggests that people can park their cars on the lawn. The answer is that they can't do that now, and there's nothing in the proposed changes to the ordinance that they would be able to do that. And I know that the city manager has a little bit of detail regarding the amendments to the parking code that were adopted by the city council that deal with parking in the front yard area in order to move those vehicles off the street.
Sure. Thank you, Mark.
Your feedback.
All right, I think we're better. We're not. Okay, so thank you, Mark. I just want to reiterate that at no time did staff ever recommend or is it allowed for cars to be parked on the sidewalk. The changes to, on the sidewalk or the lawn. The recent changes allow homes to potentially increase their private parking in the front of their house, but that has to be paved. And I think we can all think of a number of places in our community where there's not sufficient private parking, but there is room to widen the driveway by paving it, or even allow parking on the side yard if that side yard is paved. And so that's what the code allows now in an increased capacity, because we know that a number of areas in our community unfortunately has a built environment that does not have sufficient off-street parking. And we wanted to allow that through the code. It is not a by right. It still has to go through a discretionary approval process through staff. And so certainly all of the aesthetic concerns that I think are inherent with additional parking on private property in the front of the house will certainly be looked at when those requests are made. I think the other thing that I want to say as a follow-up to Mark's presentation is that the City Council is aware that we are looking into code enforcement and ways to improve our code enforcement. One of the statistics that I recently saw that 72% of our code enforcement cases are 5 years or older. That relates to some of our more challenging code enforcement cases. And so what's before you tonight are changes to Title V, really along the series of the municipal code chapter changes that we're going through, beginning at Title I, going all the way through the end of the municipal code. And so a lot of the changes that Mark talked about are really for consistency's sake, but know that staff is doing a deep dive in looking at how we handle code enforcement. And there may be additional recommendations that may very well involve changes to the code, or it may simply involve changes to how we perform code enforcement. And so I just want council to know that, and that really wasn't the thrust of tonight's conversation. The thrust of tonight's conversation was to keep with this process of going systematically through the municipal code and make adjustments for consistency and get feedback from council on anything that you feel that we should be looking at.
Okay, appreciate both. I just wanted to clarify that. I hope council understands, because I don't want anyone to get that impression that the standard is dropping and we want people to park on their lawns. I don't think that's what staff's insinuating. I don't believe the council wants to see that either. So with that, Linda, did we want to go back? Did you want me to go back to you, or would you like me just to go around? I can hit on everyone, whatever you wish.
Oh, you can. I can wait. Go ahead.
Okay, so I'm just gonna I can just see everybody here, so I'm just gonna go down the line. So Marty, I see you next to me on the screen. So why don't I have you, and then I'll just keep going down the list. We don't have to raise hands.
So I think the little bit of the confusion there for the lawn parking. The council did approve the allowance of yard parking, and that was all shown with pictures. So maybe on the next phase that we could bring some photos in that showed what that additional parking area would include. I think that would eliminate some of that confusion. For the, I'm going to try to go in order here. For the change in the number of boats, trailers, campers, it's currently 1. Is that correct, City Attorney?
That is correct.
Right. I'm fine with it remaining the same. I think I've seen there's more of a problem with inoperable vehicles than in quantity than more than 1 camper, and there's no need to change that. I'm happy with that. Mr. Mayor, do you want me to continue going through the list, or we want each person to kind of take a shot at each item?
Mark, would it be better for you if we just go through the? Yes, Marty, why don't we go? So we'll have to go back and forth. So yeah, please, if you don't mind.
Okay.
Thank you.
Sure. It wasn't noted, but this question I do have is the tightening up on vacant properties. There are a number of them that have remained in a certain degraded state. I'm looking at, I believe it would be codes 524 and 526 to have those kind of match each other a little bit better. I remember when a lot of properties were being foreclosed and the code enforcement department had to arrange an agreement with the property owner to have somebody maintain those properties, if I'm correct. I think that's something that we should be doing with these vacant properties that are in high visible areas on El Camino, where the weeds just get to be super high, and then eventually somebody has to go out there and code enforcement gives them a notice and they cut it. But those vacant properties should be on a maintenance program that was similar to the abandoned properties for the foreclosures, if that's my comment. I'm in favor of making sure the inoperable stay off driveways. I don't think there's a place for them. They should be out of view entirely. And those vehicles that need to put a tarp on for a temporary basis, that's understandable, but to leave a vehicle in a driveway with the tarp on, and now we can't tell if it's actually operable. I think perhaps the solution there is to have the license plate displayed with that type of tarp so that it could be determined that that vehicle is operable or inoperable without having to get a search warrant. My last question or clarification is for feeding of wild animals. I'm going off the presentation now. Does that include feral cats?
If I may, through the chair, Mr. Mayor.
Yes.
We've looked at a couple of different ordinances. I know staff had a couple of suggestions about what animals would be included, but we can bring back that depending on the city council's direction.
Right. There are a number of people that actually try to save these cats. I have a bigger heart for the kitties than for the pigeons. So I think getting some feedback, and there's a couple groups that could be contacted that can give you actually what they're trying to do. I think they're also trying to catch them and trying to find homes for them. So one way to get them to you is to actually feed them. So if you don't feed them, they're just going to continue running around. So I think those are my comments. So thank you.
Thanks, Marty. Any things you want to say back, Mark, or should I go to the next? All right, let's go to the next. Linda, I see your hand up. Why don't we have you next?
Okay, thanks.
You're welcome.
So I have a couple of things. One is, Mark, you mentioned in your presentation the residential parking permit program. I was just wondering if anybody has signed up for it.
I don't know the answer to that. We can check with Public Works Director. That's the department that is in charge of operating that program.
Okay, I think if we can get that, and then the numbers I mentioned earlier around the campers and like how big of a problem is that would be great. Since we're approving all of 5, I wanted to go to page 94 in the packet. It's section 5.08.040. The administrative fines, it says that the amounts of the fines imposed pursuant to this article shall be set forth in a schedule of fines established by resolution of the City Council. So since we're reviewing this, is it an appropriate time? Then I'd like to actually ask what those amounts are. And then if it's time, should we be looking at just revisiting them? Maybe we would maybe even increase them. I don't know how long ago this was approved.
Good question. So those are part of the master fee schedule, which the City Council does approve each year. And I think the amounts are 100, 200, and 500, although I'm not 100% sure of that. So 500 for the third offense. But the City Council is welcome to review those during the master fee schedule process. We usually don't like to put them directly in this ordinance because it's easier to adopt or amend a resolution than it is to amend an ordinance. So that's why we have them in the master fee schedule.
Okay, and so the resolution is approved once a year.
The master fee schedule is reviewed by City Council for increases the same or less than.
Okay, okay. So then the next part is page 94 also. It says payment of fines. And it says that fine payment shall be mailed or tendered to the city clerk of San Bruno. And I just wanted to, I don't know if that's the process. I had not heard that. And so if that's what's happening, great. If it's not happening, maybe we just need to correct it. Are fines being sent to the city clerk?
Mark, you got to unmute.
Within 15 calendar days?
Yeah. So I'm not sure about the answer to who is actually receiving the fine money. It is deposited, and we keep track of because there's an appeal period. So we can get a little more information from the department for you about that.
Okay. If that's what's happening, that's fine. This is the time to bring it up. So if we need to correct it.
Thank you.
Page 96, 5.08.090. This is late charges. So same thing, it's the same question around the resolution. So would this be in that master fee schedule too?
Yes.
Okay, so that answers that question. Page 104 is my next question, and it's 5.08.090. Hold on. 220, the abatement of the nuisance. So this said that the deadline is stated in the City Council's resolution. And so I guess my question around the abatement is, I'm imagining that that's not part of the master fee schedule. This is a separate resolution, and how can we review that? Because I know some of these abatements have been going on for a long time, and I'm wondering if the city council will have an opportunity to shorten that period of time.
So this is probably worth taking a quick look at, but I think the resolution that's being referred to here is the resolution that the city council would adopt in the event of an abatement. So for example, there aren't abatement resolutions that are just pending and waiting to be used. It's a resolution that's adopted in a particular circumstance when an abatement is required.
Okay.
Because in order to have an abatement, you have to go to court. You can't enter private property without a warrant or without some sort of court order. So
Right.
what's happened in the past is that there's been a problem on the property, the city goes to court, we get an order. In the case I'm thinking of, the gentleman appealed, there was a resolution that says, resolution to abate it, and then he didn't abate it. So then the city had to pay to abate it, and then that amount has been recorded now against the property. So that's usually how the process works.
Okay, so could we get an update, or can we actually get a copy of the resolution?
For that particular
For this,
situation?
for 5.08.220A?
Yeah, I'll see what I can find on that. Thank you.
Okay, great, that would be great. The next section is page 1. For page 116, the section in regards to regarding weed removal. I'm just curious, I don't know, I mean, again, this is new to me from a municipal standpoint, but as far as the sidewalk goes and the weeds on the sidewalk, I know we have some weeds right now that I will get to, but in some areas it just looks a little in dire need of some TLC. And I'm just wondering, is there anything that we can place in here or anything that is already, that would already cover this section? Because I do think that some owners have just completely neglected the sidewalk, and I admittedly am one of them for the time being, and we will be weeding it, but I mean there's some that have just been kind of out of control for some time.
So that's an interesting question. So remember, this title deals with things on private property, not on public property. So weeds in the sidewalk are on public property. And the provisions of weeds in here are really designed to address not just nuisance conditions, but mainly fire hazards. But with respect to weeds in the sidewalk, there's another section of our code, which is in an upcoming chapter, I'm sorry, I can't remember which one it is, that talks about the requirement for adjacent property owners to maintain the sidewalk in front of their homes.
Yep.
Right. So I don't know that the city has enforced weed abatement on sidewalks under that particular section of the code.
So is it, I think just to make sure that they're cohesive, is this a good place to place it where it would balance it out as a nuisance? Or would you recommend waiting till we cover that code? And I don't know if we're going to cover that code because it sounds like that's a whole different section.
It's a different title. It'll come to eventually, hopefully soon.
Okay.
Yeah,
Okay.
but I would recommend not putting it in here because we want to keep this just a private property.
Okay. Okay. I think it's page 136. I guess this section, I'm just trying to figure out the benefit of the alcohol of this change in, it's under the definitions, the deemed approved activity. Is it essentially, is this grandfathering in these commercial activities?
Yeah, so it's slightly confusing. Thanks for asking. So the original code said that if you're alcohol establishment was approved before the old zoning code, which I think was 2003, then those activities are based on a different set of standards. In other words, they're legal non-conforming and they can continue. So the only thing I wanted to make sure is that by amending this code, you didn't suddenly extend that date to 2020, right? So now everything between 2003 and 2020 is automatically legal non-conforming. No, we want to just keep that 2003 date. So that was the reason for the change.
To keep it, okay. And then I'm almost done. There was a section, but I'm not seeing it in my notes. There had been a suggestion to add around, I think it's the illegal growth of cannabis. I'm looking for it right now. I'm sorry I didn't note it. And I just want to make sure it looks.
Sorry, I remembered that, but I'm not exactly sure where that is located. This is not the cannabis part of the code, obviously.
But it is, I mean, it's part of this Title V.
Yeah, we can search for that and.
Okay, I'll keep, let me see if I can find it while I'm talking. And then I guess another question is, would it be possible, and I guess the problem would be from an administrative standpoint is how you actually enforce it, but I'd be curious to know if it would be possible to somehow add, if we're talking about, individuals who can have cars, the number of cars or inoperable vehicles, is there any way to add to the definition of nuisance people who are parking their cars to go to the airport? If it can be proven that that's in fact where they're going? Because I know that's been a pretty big complaint.
Yeah, so that is a difficult problem to solve, and it's a problem that is, I think, best addressed by the residential permit parking program. That's sort of exactly what that's designed to address, where there's an influx from an external source of individuals parking and taking up street parking that should be able to be used by the neighborhood. The difficulty with having it in this title or any other title is, again, this is private property only, not public property. But the difficulty is, yes, of course, with respect to enforcement, it's not a nuisance if the same car. I mean, we're not going to be able to find out why are you parking there. Right. So we can't ask people, why did you park your car? And yes, we know there are reports, of course, of people parking in neighborhoods so they can go to the airport. We've seen people do it. We know that's happening. Best addressed, I think, by a residential permit parking program.
Okay, and then we'll find out how many people have actually gotten that at the next meeting, right? Or whenever this comes back to us. Okay, and then I found it. It's on page 92, at the bottom of page 92. And it says, well, I won't read it all. I'll wait for you to get to it.
Yeah. Oh, I see it. I understand. Yeah, so this was added to be consistent with new California laws having to do with building and plumbing codes. And the only thing, of course, relating to cannabis is making sure that there's evidence, if there is cannabis being grown on the property, which is allowed under state law, that the agreement, the rental agreement, if it's a problem, that prohibits it. So it's not something that normally staff would enforce unless there's a complaint that there's more than the allowed amount of cannabis being grown on the property.
Okay, that helps. Thank you. And then just one more suggestion is regarding the inoperable vehicles. Would it be possible, and again, I don't know, would it be possible to have inoperable vehicles register with the city and pay a fee?
So that's a good question. Probably something we might want to check with the police department about. I don't know that the city can require additional registration of private property over and above what the state requires. And I'm taking a guess at this, so I apologize if it turns out to be wrong, because I've never been asked that question. But probably that's a preemption issue in that the state occupies the field of vehicle registration. And I think it's unlikely that, or at least there might be a problem with that, but I'll be happy to look into that and bring back an answer for you.
Okay, great. Okay, thank you so much, everybody, for indulging me. Thank you.
Thanks. Laura?
Hey, I think just on that point, I think that, and I know you haven't gone through this process before, a lot of these things, Councilmember Mason, but I think sending an email to Mark prior to these meetings, I think you have a lot of great questions, a lot of good details that he might be more prepared for some answers, or at least be able to give you some of these answers. I know that's always, I found very helpful. And Javon, I'll appreciate this statement. Staff likes to get these questions by at least, I try to send them Sunday night, if not early Monday morning, so you guys have the time to work on them. But thank you, Mark, for your presentation. I'm a very clear no on allowing additional boats, RVs, or trailers on somebody's property. I think the more we allow, the more the residents go out and buy. And I understand the need. It's expensive to store a boat or a trailer somewhere else. And if you happen to have the few properties in San Bruno that have the luxury of being able to have a nice wide space to be able to store that, that's great. But I think it's more of an eyesore to see more of that on your property. Any inoperable vehicle, I don't think it should be screened. I think, yes, on prohibiting any inoperable vehicle from being screened. I think it just takes, they shouldn't be there. I think it just takes away from our authority to do anything. And I guess the question I was going to have is, what is the definition of screened? Is it anything that sort of, go ahead, Mark.
Yeah, that's also a good question. So some of those definitions are really in the zoning code. And one of the things that we didn't have time to do before tonight's meeting is check to understand with Community Development Department, what does that really mean? And I think from a practical standpoint, it certainly means a fence. It could be a hedge that is tall enough that you can't see it from the public right of way. But this is one of those areas where it's really, the goal is to not see it from the public right of way. And so oftentimes it is involving the exercise of discretion by a code enforcement officer. If you can see the tip of the antenna of the inoperable car, is that enough? It's hard to say. If you can see the whole thing, everybody would agree, well, no, you can't do that. So it's really done on a case-by-case basis. And I think that trying to come up with what's appropriate screening or what isn't is a conversation we'll need to have with community development to see if they have some standards around that. And so I understand your desire to basically say no to inoperable vehicles, whether they're screened or not. And so the result of that would, I think, be that we would have a effort by the Code Enforcement Department to abate inoperable vehicles on private property. And we do have part of our processes that would allow us to do that. It's an involved due process because you're essentially taking away somebody's private property. And so other cities have done that at some significant expense. But that is something that the city can do from an operational standpoint. It's a matter of time and resources. So if we do put that in the code, I think it's important to understand that we need the staff will need the resources to engage a program to abate those vehicles on private property.
I mean, the other problem is I've seen several vehicles now. There's one up in the Glenview neighborhood. There's one up, in fact, in the backyard of the house fire on Rosewood, of these inoperable vehicles. And I would hate living next door knowing that you've got a vehicle parked in the backyard. It probably has some sort of gasoline in the tank, and it's just a hazard. And so I think when they're unseen, we have the potential for a hazard. And with that house fire on Rosewood, that had to be, I know very scary for the neighbors, the surrounding neighbors. Tarps, I think it just creates another problem in the community. I think the tarp looks good for about the first month, and then the San Bruno winds and the elements tear it up, and before you know it, it's just shredded tarp. And I think that just, again, and it leads for more problems when you can't see what's going on. But, you know, I mean, the goal here, and I think, I know for the few residents who spoke, we want to be proud of our city. We want it to be a beautiful city. We don't want something where we allow for people to just leave inoperable vehicles on a driveway somewhere where, you know, the weeds are growing underneath the tires or underneath the vehicle. And it just, it's unsightly. And that's not a neighborhood that I want to live in. Thank you.
Michael Salazar.
Thanks, Mark, for the study. I think we're doing really great on revisiting all these things and getting everything aligned with our zoning and getting the municipal code up to date. So really appreciate you staying on task with this. I had, you know, I'm looking in the report on the definition of inoperable vehicle. And I noticed one of the conditions that could define an inoperable vehicle is lacking a current registration. And there are, the DMV does allow people to register a vehicle as non-operational. It doesn't mean that it doesn't run. It just means that they are not planning on using it on the road and they don't get a new tag, and they are still compliant basically with the state regulations on the vehicle. So if we designate those vehicles that are basically compliant with the state as inoperable as well, based on this definition, would those then also run afoul of our ordinance and being able to have those in a driveway?
Yeah, that's an interesting point. And, you know, what we want to try to figure out is what is the issue that we're trying to solve. And clearly, it doesn't matter to anybody who lives in the neighborhood or any member of the public whether the vehicle has a tag on it that's expired or not expired, right? That's not the point. The point is the appearance of the vehicle and the fact that vehicles that are not operational are more likely to appear as a public nuisance. That's what we're trying to get at. Mm-hmm. So the fact of are they registered or not, or do they have a certificate or don't they, is probably not the way to address the blight of inoperable vehicles. But that is something we can look into and talk to the police department about. We did discuss these sorts of issues with them regarding parking on streets, which is another topic, because there the registration has to be expired for more than 6 months before you can tow the vehicle, as I recall. So there are lots of restrictions in terms of towing vehicles, you know, and you can cite them, but then people don't pay, and then so what? The vehicle is still there. So if we really want to address the problem, it's really the appearance of it, or saying that you can't have these on private property. But I'll look at that definition and look at the non-operational registration to see if that's something that we could look at.
Yeah, and it's curious that aesthetics becomes an issue here, because I can have a really nice looking car with no engine in it. It's inoperable. And I can't use it. It's sitting there just taking up space. But if it looks nice and nobody complains about it, then it's okay. Exactly. Versus I could have just an old rust bucket that's my daily driver, and it completely deteriorates everybody's property values, but it runs and I drive it every day and it's parked on the street, and then that's okay. So that's where I kind of have some problem with this, where we're trying to define these things based on a problem. And I understand the problem is that there are some ugly cars that don't drive that people have complained about. But at the same time, you know, if we do this blanket sort of statement, is that anything that doesn't run can't be there. And you said on the street, you won't tow it for 6 months, but so how long is it? 6 months sitting in a driveway where it's deemed a problem, or is it 1 month in the driveway? Is it a year in the driveway? Multiple years? Do we wait until there's weeds growing under the thing before we say it's an issue? So I feel like we really need to have a little bit more definition and guidance for people to know what is appropriate. if we are going to make any changes. I mean, I think right now there's enough in what I'm seeing here where we could definitely, with complaints from enough neighbors, take action on some of these things. So I don't know that we need to necessarily change a lot of that. And then just regarding tarps, I mean, are we using the term tarp and car cover interchangeably? Because again, that could make a big difference, right? You could have a very nice car cover on a very nice car parked out there, and do that now. Those cars now get categorized along with the ones that are using tarps to disguise, you know, the fact that they're junk.
Right. You put your finger on another problem, a potential problem with saying we're going to eliminate all tarps is how do you define that? And you're right, Council Member Davis indicated that tarp or whatever it is, or cover might look good in a certain period of time and maybe not later. So we do have parts of the nuisance of Title V that talk about things that are dilapidated. So that's a word that's used, and obviously that's a judgment call. So that's a situation where if the tarp or cover, whatever it is dilapidated, we could say, no, you've got to get rid of it. But the answer to that isn't going to be, we're going to take your car from you. The answer is you're going to get a new tarp for it, right? Or a new cover. So it's the potential penalty has to match what is it that's creating the nuisance. And if the nuisance is created by an ugly cover, then the solution to that nuisance is getting a new cover.
Okay. All right. Okay. That makes sense. And then in terms of the number of, you know, non-car type vehicles, I think, yeah, I agree with everyone else that we should keep that number the same. I don't see any need to expand that. And in regard to the pigeons, yeah, I think that's definitely a problem that promotes things. And listening to Marty's concerns about the cats, you know, I get, you know, cats actually, feral cats do provide a service in that they eliminate some vermin that are loose in the yard. But if people aren't careful about how they feed them, they could also potentially attract other undesirable animals like raccoons and skunks, foxes, and those animals then attract coyotes and mountain lions, and probably don't want to attract those things into our neighborhoods. So if we are going to address feeding wild animals, perhaps we can also include some guidelines around what is acceptable and not when it comes to feral cats, if we want to permit that.
We can bring that back for you for some further analysis.
Thank you. That's all I got.
I'm sorry?
That's all I got.
Okay, thanks, Michael. Mark, on one section, and it says camper shells which are left for an unreasonable period of time in front of yards and are visible from the street. So I know what it means, but when it says unreasonable period, how is that measured? How is that quantified?
So normally what would happen is if there's a complaint from somebody in the neighborhood, says, you know, he's had his camper shell out there for 6 years and hasn't done anything about it. Code enforcement would go to the person and say, have you had it out here for 6 years? And the person says, yes. Well, probably that's an unreasonable amount of time. I think the intent of that is to allow people to use their camper shells during the year, during camping season, whenever that might be, or if they're retired, maybe throughout the year, but not to have it as a storage place for those shells. So the distinction is that the property is being used by the resident as opposed to it's just a place to store it. And that is hard to determine. You're right, Mr. Mayor, is that it's not well defined. We can certainly take a look at that.
Okay, and I would agree with keeping the number the same as was indicated by Michael. In my understanding, just so we're clear, if there is a vehicle of any vehicle that is in a driveway that doesn't have an engine, it's on blocks, that is not acceptable. Is that correct?
Right now, if it's not screened, you can't have that in your driveway. That's correct.
Okay, so that's one thing. So if the vehicle is in the driveway and there are weeds and cobwebs and whatever nests that have developed, but it's in the driveway, but it does have an engine, it does have its tires, is that still acceptable?
If the vehicle is operable but ugly, you can park it in your driveway.
And how does one determine if it is quote operable unless you really turn on the engine? I mean, so
there is a definition in the code about what constitutes operability, and I don't have it at hand, but I know there's a number of factors that staff would use to determine that. Again, it's not an easy thing to do. The person doesn't have to allow you to turn it on. The person doesn't have to comply with a request to turn it on to see if it is operable. So really that determination has to be made in the worst case scenario from the public right of way visually by the code enforcement officer.
okay. And I'll echo some of the comments my colleagues made about, additional RV or boats. I agree. Keep in mind what had happened years ago, from my memory, was that an initiative was placed to not allow any of those on the side, on street, public street. I think it was a very close vote, maybe 65 votes, but it did cause quite a stir in the community. Some folks believed it was, what you could and couldn't have, and your house, your home is your castle. The other thing is on the aspect of graffiti. Most of that has been kept and was expanded some years ago as far as making sure things were locked up, making sure how it was quantified and defined as times have changed. But are we still under the same premise as far as mitigation is concerned, whether it's 24 hours for gang or profanity and it's under the 72-hour notice if it's other than that to businesses or residential?
Yes, I do understand from the community development department that they have a graffiti hotline. It's actively monitored, and I understand that that's taken care of as quickly as possible. We have a graffiti abatement contractor that we use for that,
which has been a big help. And I do know that when a place continues it, and again, if folks can go back in time on what it was like, it was horrific here. But they are told they have to take precautions, whether it's lighting, whether it's vegetation or something, and then they will be assessed that money. So I appreciate that. I think I'm good for now. Mark, is there any more information, or have we provided you enough, too much information tonight?
No, this is very helpful. I think I've got all the comments written down. I'll go over them with our staff, in the coming days. And we'll bring back a staff report and with some of the information, that's been requested, and then provide some proposed changes to the ordinance that reflects your direction.
Okay, if nothing else from council, I'm not seeing anything, we're going to, again, this was just a provide direction, which we have done. We're going to move on to item B. City Clerk.
Item 7B, discuss and provide direction regarding an urgency ordinance establishing a temporary moratorium on evictions for non-payment of rent by small business commercial tenants directly affected by the COVID-19 pandemic.
City Attorney.
Mr. Mayor, I apologize in advance for having to listen to me twice tonight. 2 doses of the city attorney is more than most city councils can take. So
it's okay, you were kind of quiet the last council meeting, so this makes up.
If you just give us a second, we'll try to get the document up on the screen. Hold on. All right, is everybody able to see that?
Yes, I can.
Excellent. Thank you. Okay, so our last conduct of business topic is discussion and direction regarding commercial eviction urgency ordinance. So here's our agenda. We have a little background. We're going to talk about the policy rationale for such an ordinance, briefly discuss the legal basis, and then talk about some of the different provisions that such an ordinance might include, and then end with next steps. So as you know, on March 16th of this year, there was a shelter-in-place order and an emergency proclamation by both the county and the city of San Bruno. And on that same date, the governor issued an order authorizing local jurisdictions to adopt residential and commercial moratoria on evictions. And so that was an authorization. It wasn't a requirement to do so. The state left it up to individual entities such as cities and counties. So on the 23rd of March, the county did adopt a moratorium on residential evictions covering the entire county. So in other words, all residential evictions everywhere in the county, cities or unincorporated areas are now covered by that moratorium. And I believe that the Board of Supervisors also just recently enacted, with respect to that particular moratorium, a rent freeze. And I'm sorry, I don't have all the details of that at hand, but that's an action that the Board of Supervisors recently took, if memory serves. On April 7th, the Board of Supervisors adopted a moratorium on commercial evictions, but covering only the unincorporated areas. So in this one, unlike the residential eviction ordinance, they chose not to include all of the cities in the order. So it only covers unincorporated areas. So let's talk a little bit about what the policy rationales for such an ordinance might be. I think the first one is obvious. We're currently in a pandemic resulting in a severe and unprecedented economic and social dislocation. So in cities and the county do have a public interest in small businesses remaining open because those businesses provide essential services. So that's important, and that's good for the public health, safety, and welfare, which is a reason that you can adopt one of these ordinances if you so desire. There's also a public interest in other small businesses that are not currently open, allowing them to reopen or putting them in a financial position where they might be able to reopen when it's allowed. And again, that's a strong public interest. There are a couple of other considerations that came up regarding the discussion of such an ordinance. And so one consideration is that commercial tenants and landlords may be in a more equal bargaining position than their residential counterparts. Another issue that was raised is that some landlords might actually qualify as small businesses. So in other words, you have a small business tenant, but you might also have a small business landlord. And so that's just something to consider in terms of each individual community. And then finally, the other thing to keep in mind is that the courts are basically closed to eviction cases. They're not going to be hearing any of them until 90 days after the shelter order is lifted by the governor. So there will not actually be any evictions at the earliest until 90 days after the shelter-in-place order is lifted. And actually quite a bit after that, because what happens on day 91 is that the lawsuit can actually be served, and then there's time to answer, could be discovery, there's all kinds of things. So lawsuits regarding commercial evictions are unlikely to proceed any time in the near future. So what would be the legal basis for an ordinance prohibiting commercial evictions at this time? Well, the government code does give you the opportunity to adopt an urgency ordinance, protect the public peace, health, safety, and welfare. That's very general. But for an urgency ordinance, you really need some detailed factual findings. And you'll see those factual findings in a variety of expressions in both the county ordinance and in the city ordinances that have been adopted that I attached to your staff report. The good news about those findings is that the courts will generally defer to the city council's findings. So if the city council says something is an urgent problem, the courts usually aren't going to second guess that unless there is some sort of overriding either a constitutional or other state law issue that the court identifies. Urgency ordinances, which are adopted at one meeting, you don't need two readings like most other ordinances, do require a 4/5 vote of the council. So we're not asking you to vote on anything tonight, but we are looking for some direction about whether you're interested in adopting such an ordinance. So let's talk just for a few minutes about what such an ordinance might contain. And the basic goal of the ordinance is to prohibit steps being taken toward commercial evictions. Well, what does that mean? And so normally that means that before you can evict a tenant, you have to send them a notice. It's either a 3-day notice pay or quit, or it's a 30-day notice if that's what's allowed by the lease. It says that we want to evict you based on either non-payment of rent or for some other reason. So what these ordinances do that the county and other cities have adopted is they say that if the tenant can't pay for a reason that's directly related to COVID-19 conditions, then the ordinance prohibits the landlord from evicting them under certain circumstances. And so you'll see if you look at the ordinances that there's sort of a large number of conditions that might qualify for this. Loss of income, gross receipts, medical bills and expenses. Maybe the business was closed. Obviously, that's going to be a problem. But it has to be related to COVID-19. It can't just be the business was failing before and now it's really failed, and it's not related to COVID-19. And so what this requires, or what these ordinances uniformly require, is the landlord, before they serve any sort of notice, they have to give notice to the tenant that this ordinance exists. And the city or the county would come up with a form for that. And it requires the tenant to document the loss in income or other conditions that are related to COVID-19. So the rent isn't forgiven, it still remains due, and it remains due, however, after the ordinance expires. And all of the ordinances that we've got for you this evening, they all expire on May 31st. And I think that date was selected as the current outside date of when the shelter-in-place orders might be in effect. It's certainly possible they would be extended. And you could extend this ordinance as well if you wanted to, or re-adopt a new one. But the ones that are in your packet are all expire on the 31st. So these are the provisions that are essentially common to all ordinances. So what are some of the differences in the ordinances? Well, let's talk about those. Well, the first question is, what's the definition of a small business? And it's a small business who gets the benefit of the ordinance. So there's a couple of different definitions. There's three of them, actually. So the county and Menlo Park and Pacifica say that if you have gross receipts of less than $2.5 million, you're a small business. And the basis for that was because that is the same definition of a small business used by SAMCETA, apparently in the grant or loan programs that they're facilitating. Millbrae decided to say to cover businesses that have gross receipts of up to $5 million. So obviously that would cover more businesses than if it was $2.5 million. And the cities of San Mateo and South San Francisco said 25 million, again, obviously covering quite a bit many more businesses. So the question for San Bruno is, what's the right number? And that's a policy decision for you. And so we did a little research, thank you to the finance department. We've got about 2,900 businesses that pay a business license tax, and a little over 4% have gross receipts of more than 5 million. A little over 7%, the numbers in parentheses are the actual numbers. About 7% have gross receipts of 2.5 to 5, and 16% have gross receipts between 1 and 2.5. So basically what that means is if you said everybody under 2.5 million gross receipts is a small business, you would capture everyone below that threshold. So in other words, it would be the 7.1, the 16%, and then everybody that's less than $1 million, which is quite a few of our businesses, as you can tell. So that's one policy decision for the city to make. And don't worry, we'll summarize these at the end, so you don't have to keep them in mind. So the next question is, what's the date that the ordinance is effective? And most of them have made it the date of adoption. But there is an option that we've discussed where the ordinance could be made retroactive to the date of non-expired notices of eviction. So for example, if I'm a tenant and I've already received a notice of eviction, but it hasn't expired yet, the ordinance could be made applicable to them. All right, what are the other issues that we might want to look at? So the next question is, how much time do you have to pay after the ordinance expires? And again, we have a little variation. Pacifica said basically 90 days. And the other said a total of 180 days, 180, but some of them in increments. So in other words, you get 90 up front and then you get 30-day increments as long as you can prove that you're still having a problem. So that's a policy decision for the city council. Do you want to go for a shorter amount and then provide increments, or do you want to just say 180 days or something in between? Another policy question is whether the ordinance should have a hardship waiver for the landlord. What does that mean? And what that's referring to is if the landlord can come in and say, wait a second, you know, maybe I'm a small business too, and if I don't get this rent, I'm going to go out of business. And that's a waiver that the city manager in these ordinances would be allowed to grant. And the county and South San Francisco, the city of South City, said, no, we're not going to put that in the ordinance. And the others did. And I asked, well, why was that? And one of the reasons is because having that waiver allows the city to better defend the ordinance. In other words, there's a safety valve. And one of the things we like to do as lawyers is always create a safety valve so that way there's some discretion that can be exercised in an unusual case. And then the final topic of discussion and direction is whether you want to include an option for the city to enforce the ordinance. And Pacifica said, no, we'll allow that to the private parties. And the other said, yes, we'll allow an option of city enforcement. I think it's an open question about how the city would enforce it. It would be difficult and somewhat intrusive because the city's getting involved in the commercial relationships between commercial landlords and tenants. So it's not clear that we're really set up to do that, but most cities did include the option, at least, of city enforcement, which is not to say they're going to enforce it. So here's a summary of the questions for tonight. Do you want to have an expiration date of the 31st? Everybody does. What's your definition of a small business? Should it be $1 million, 2.5, 25 million? What should be the effective date of the ordinance? Either when it's adopted or retroactive to the date of unexpired notices. What should the time to pay be? Up to 6 months after the order is lifted or in increments? Landlord hardship waiver, and then finally the option for city enforcement. So I'll leave this slide up, but I'm happy to answer any questions.
Questions from colleagues? Anyone?
Mr. Mayor?
Marty, thank you.
Yeah. City Attorney, could you discuss like the risk in these different options that we have here? Just kind of go through them and just kind of make us feel a little more certain on how much trouble we can get into or stay out of.
Yeah. So the one thing that will probably mitigate your risk the most is to include a hardship waiver for the landlord, to include that provision. It's not really clear to me why other cities didn't include it. I know there are a couple of other cities that are either deciding or have decided in the last day or two, and I don't have that information. But that's important because that means that it's harder for a landlord to do what's called a facial challenge to the ordinance. In other words, the ordinance on its face is somehow illegal or unconstitutional. So that's generally not going to be the case in the discretionary approval that the city or exception that the city can make. In terms of the legal risk overall, I think the county recognized some additional legal risk. It's probably why they didn't apply it to the whole county like they did the residential ordinance. And that legal risk comes from the fact that the residential eviction ordinance is directly related to the shelter-in-place order. So if you're evicted from your house, well, you can't shelter in place. So now you're in a catch-22, you're violating the order. Whereas a commercial eviction, presumably, those folks have a place to live. They're not really violating the order. So I think they looked at that and thought, well, if you're the county, you can take on the first risk. They didn't want to take on the second one. Having said that, most cities on the peninsula are either considering or have adopted this.
Mayor Medina, can we get a input from the community? I think there's a question up there.
Let me see. Melissa, do you see
Yes, I do. Mark, I'm gonna take away your screen sharing for the moment.
Okay.
And then, Mr. Seymour, can you hear us?
Yes, I can.
We can hear you.
Sometimes I think it's just me and you guys. So anyways, we have a whole city of 45,000 people, so it would be nice if others contributed. But so the best I understand here is this is for commercial, but I also think we need to talk about residential. And I'll leave that aside. You guys can discuss that. On the small business, I would say it would be anything below 2.5 million, and that's without the credentials or knowledge to suggest that, but just based on the information that was just given. Time to pay, I think, once we get through this, it's unreasonable to ask people to pay within 30 or 90 days. I mean, they haven't made any money. The 180 is even an issue. And I'd like to think that we're a community of commercial entrepreneurs and business folks who might forgive those who can forgive the fact that the payment would even need to be made. Landlord hardship, I agree with that. I think there are a lot of landlords out there who are in the same position that their tenants are. So you need to work that into the situation. In city enforcement, I think that, I mean, I'm not a lawyer. I'm sending my daughter to law school so that she can give me some pointers. But I would think that that's something that needs to be left up to the legal system to address. But I do think that this is an important issue that we need to talk about as a community, because if we're going to come through this in a way with the least amount of damage, then we need to work together as a community, both as landlords and tenants, both in the commercial and residential sector. And I think that we're a small town, so I have a lot of optimism in what we can do together, and I'm really looking forward to seeing what you can all craft to help make that happen. And those are my comments. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Stephen. Is there anybody else, Melissa?
No, I don't see anybody at this time. No.
Okay. All right. So why don't we bring it to council for comments or thoughts? Of course, the city attorney is looking for some direction on some of the items he brought up.
Can Mark share his screen again, please, with the list of items? Please.
Mark, can you share your screen, please, with a list of items we're being asked? And then Linda, go ahead.
Yeah, I wanted to thank Mark and staff for bringing this item forward. I think that as a council, everybody has expressed concern over our small business community and how we can help. And as COVID-19 has really evolved and paralyzed our economy here in San Bruno, it's been really hard to figure out how we're going to help small businesses, because other cities, I believe Burlingame, practically overnight was able to come up with over $500,000 to help with their small business community. So I think this is one way that we can help our small business community, because we don't have the money that other cities have. And I think this is really an appropriate step for government to come in and really help its small business community. We're not taking anything from the landlords. We're going to ensure that landlords get paid. We're not requiring, anything to not be paid. We're just saying, hey, we need to give our small businesses an opportunity to get back on their feet. So with that said, I would advocate for a 180-day period. I would advocate for the small business definition to be, I I didn't write it down, Mark, but you had a slide where you actually laid out all the different small business allocations. So maybe we can go back to that, but let me go down the rest of this list. Oh, go ahead.
There you go.
Okay, great, thank you. So yeah, I would go, I would actually honestly go all the way to the 5 million and under, to be quite honest, because everything is just so expensive in the Bay Area. And then what's the, and then I'm sorry, Mark, if you could go back to your checklist again, just so I hit all of your. Okay. Effective date, I think it should be retroactive. This caught a lot of people by surprise, the COVID-19 shelter in place. So retroactive to the date that the declaration of emergency was also retroactively placed by resolution. Time to pay 180 days. Landlord hardship waiver. Yes, I think a landlord should have a hardship waiver. And then the option of the city enforcement. I don't think the city should be the enforcement branch for this particular this direction that we hopefully will take. So hopefully that provides you some additional instruction, Mark. I think, but I think this is great, and I really think that our small business community, many, just so everyone knows, I'm not sure what conversations council's had, but I've spoken to a number of business owners, and none of them have gotten a break on their rent. So I think it's really important that we help them, especially those that are not considered essential right now and are closed, but are still being asked to pay their rent. I think it's important that we really stand up for them. Thank you.
Linda, I'm sorry. Thank you, Linda. Laura?
Thank you. Hey, great comment, Linda. I think you bring up an excellent point with, a city like Burlingame. We just don't have the resources to support our small businesses, and I think this is definitely needed. I was actually willing to support all of your actions, Linda. I was going to say up to 2.5 million, but I'm willing to support up to 5 million. I can't imagine to be a small business owner, a family owned a business for many, many years, and to close the front doors for so many months is just devastating. And so what we can do to how we can help out, I'm also all in supportive. So ditto Mike Linda's comments.
Michael or Marty?
Yeah, I agree. This is going to be very difficult for people to get out of this hole. There's no forgiveness of loans or of any kind. It's looking pretty bleak. Hearing from Jackie Spears' comments at a conference call about the number of restaurants that are likely not to reopen in the 50% range, and that's really, really scary. And will have consequences in all across California. So I'm in support of all of this. The 5 million is fine, and everything else that Linda said, that was fine. I'm fine with that.
Michael?
Yeah, I'm also in favor. I believe the 5 million is probably a good place to be. That still only covers about a quarter of the businesses, according to these statistics on the slide. It is potentially shifting this burden onto a different group of people, and I think that the hardship waiver is necessary because we are shifting that burden, and I wouldn't say that it's without risk, because if we're basically preventing these people to make business decisions for up to 6 months, and some of these businesses don't come back, they may never get paid, and so they're out 6 months rent. So I wouldn't say that it's not without any risk to the landlords. So I believe the hardship waiver may allow them some way out of this, given that the state has already decided that their protection is going to extend 90 days past the shelter in place order, which is as yet undefined. That number could, it could go on for a while, but if we can define a process where, that there is a system in place for them to pay it back, and that they have some recourses, and we can, help them out in some way, I think it is the right thing to do. In terms of city enforcement, Mark, you said that the other cities are going to provide some sort of enforcement, but maybe can you explain a little bit more about what that might look like for us? I mean, I know we're definitely not equipped to do that now, but do you have any indication about what the other cities are going to do, and if there's anything that we could do to emulate what they're doing?
Yeah, that's a good question. I don't know the answer to that. I do know that I don't think any of the cities said that they're going to enforce it. What they've done is they just included the standard provisions in their ordinances that say the city is authorized to enforce. So they're not promising to enforce it, they're just saying they're authorized to do that. Whereas the Pacifica omitted that from their ordinance. And so that's how we concluded they're not going to be enforcing it, because it doesn't say they're authorized to. So, and then I did want to just make one other comment, if I might. I wanted to clarify something, and it may have been my error in the presentation. So the gross receipts of 5 million and below, that's actually going to cover about 95% of the businesses in the city, because only 4.4% of businesses in the city have gross receipts of more than $5 million. So at the $5 million level, you're covering pretty much just about everyone.
I see. So the percentages in that slide, what do those represent?
So I'm sorry, it's sort of the opposite of how the ordinances are written, but that's the data that we had. So with those, the percentages represented the businesses that are making more than that particular number. So the way our business license tax works is that if it's up to a certain amount, you pay X. If it's between X and Y, then you pay more. If it's between Y and Z, then you pay more. And those thresholds are $1 million, 2.5, and 5 million. So the only people over $5 million are 128 businesses, 4.4%.
Gotcha.
So yeah, so therefore, if the threshold, let's just say for sake of argument, were 2.5 million, that would be not including about 12% of the businesses, but you would be including everybody other than those 12%. So it's 88% at 2.5 million, and about 96% at 5 million.
So the 5 million mark includes pretty much everyone.
Just about.
Just about. Okay. All right. Fair enough.
Any other thing else, Michael?
No, I think that covers it.
Marty, I see your hand up.
Yes, thank you. Do we, I was contacted by one business owner that received an eviction notice. Does the city have any additional numbers of businesses that have called asking about this ordinance, or have expressed any interest in pursuing with this ordinance?
So the city manager is indicating no, we have not, as far as we know. And we also did check with the community development department, and my understanding is they have not as well.
Okay, thank you.
Mm-hmm.
And then for me, it seems like we're pretty much all on the same page. And this is something that when the San Mateo County mayors met with the county and they established a global coverage for the whole county when they took action in regards to residential. As they took action this morning, which is a little off the topic, but they did a residential freeze on a moratorium on rent increases, but that will cover the whole county. So that's already been enacted as of today's action by the Board of Supervisors. But what they didn't want to do by their legal counsel was take on this topic. They were willing to do it for the unincorporated areas, but not for the rest of the county. And that was their legal counsel saying that there was risk, that they didn't want to blanket us. So I think the risk is at this point, because the courts are closed and everything else nominal, but I think it's significant and important enough that we need to also do what we can. It is just something I've always told people, you know, as we welcomed in 220, could we ever imagine we'd be sitting here going through this today? Nothing that we had thought of. But it sounds like we're, Mark, from my knowledge, is that we're talking 180 days. We're talking up to 5 million gross receipts. We're talking retro back to the emergency. We're talking a landlord waiver. And to go back to the emergency, does that give us any more risk or problem for us as a city than it would if it wasn't retro?
I think it's slightly more risk than what I indicated in my presentation. So what I was talking about in my presentation is retroactivity to the date of any unexpired notice of eviction. So that may or may not be back to the effective date of the shelter-in-place order. So for example, if I got a notice of eviction 2 weeks before the shelter-in-place order, there was a 30-day notice, well, that's already expired. And so that eviction was occurring beforehand. So I was not necessarily recommending, although it's a policy decision for you, that this reach back that far. I was recommending that it reach back to the point of any notices of eviction that have not yet expired. In other words, the small business owner got a notice and it's still within that 30-day period, or it's within some extension of that.
Okay, so I guess that's the only thing I am trying to get a better handle on, because obviously we're willing to assume some risk, but I mean you're trying to quantify that type of risk level.
Yeah, it is a little riskier to go back to the shelter-in-place order. On the other hand, that was only March 16th. It's hard to believe it was only 6 weeks ago. So you're really only taking on another 2 weeks of risk in that situation. So.
Okay, well then, thank you. Thank you for the clarification. Okay, so Mark, do you feel that you have enough feedback from council?
I do. I actually have one other question on the 180 days. Is that something that the city council wants to do in increments? You know, most of the cities did 90 and then, 90 for sure. And then you get 3 30-day extensions if you can prove that you're still having a problem. Is that the intent, or are you interested in just doing 180 days right out of the gate?
Oh, so maybe do 90 days and then you're saying do 30-day extensions, which
I think that's what most of the other cities did, that so that there is some discretion there. And so that you're not telling landlords, okay, you're not going to get paid for 6 months no matter what.
Right.
Yeah, and I know the county is doing the 30 days with the review on the residential rent increases because of state law and the governor's and all of that. But I am in favor of the 90 days with the 30-day extension, because obviously we don't know where it's going, what have you. So I'm okay with that as well. So that's just my thought.
I agree.
I agree.
Okay, very good.
Agreed.
Okay.
All right,
Oh, sorry.
We'll bring
Just
that
one
back at the
thing.
next meeting.
Just one thing to think about, the city attorney, is if we do the 90 days and then we add the 30 days, does that then trigger the city to notice everybody every 30 days of the extension?
Good question. No, that would be the landlord's responsibility.
To notify the tenants.
Right.
Okay.
Yeah, I'll confirm that, but I think that's the case.
Okay. Thank you.
Okay. Anything else, Mark?
That'll do it. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Now let's move on to item 8, comments from council members. Anybody who has comments, if you raise your hand. Other than that, I will assume you do not. Okay, I'm not seeing any hands. I do. Marty.
Had a little trouble finding the raise hand thing.
I just wanted to acknowledge everybody's efforts, staff, my colleagues, our residents. This is tough. I also wanted to thank a volunteer, a donor who wished to remain anonymous, who gave 25 boxes, I think it was, of gloves, of the nitrile gloves that I donated to our community development department. And that's just what I love about our community. It's at how we do get together, and this person doesn't want to even be named, so thank you, and everybody hang in there. We're going to get through this. Thank you.
Okay, any other council member? If not, also just want to, in closing, of course, thank staff for the communication, the PSAs, the other elements that they've been putting out there, and trying to keep everybody informed. It is obviously, I think people were looking forward to May, and I don't know that they all still feel the same way about May. But with that said, I still remind folks because, and this was for essential needs, but I mean, going to the post office last Thursday to turn in my passport. No, I'm not traveling anywhere, but it was going to expire. 3 people without face masks. Going into Walgreens to get the picture taken, 2 people without face masks, being close together. So I think, again, we still need to really take it serious. And I think we really need to know that whether you feel healthy, what you can in return do, not even knowing it, can cause. So again, I don't think Chief Johansson would say be the police on it, but I know I'm getting calls, texts, or emails about these people on a basketball court or this or that. If you feel compelled, then call the non-emergency number. But reaching out to us is not going to get us out there faster or to be able to resolve it. But yes, patience is key. Finally, for PG&E, I alluded to that earlier, and I think it's important that the PG&E public safety power shut off. It's not to scare anyone, but obviously we went through this before. I want to assure you that in the Emergency Services Council, we made it very clear to that staff in the county for PG&E to be mindful and understanding. We know that people have stock fridges, they have their medications, so they need to be diligent and they need to be succinct in what they do and not just turn off more than they need. But what is important is to update your contact information. And you see here the website as well as the contact phone number. And that is so they can call you, that they have a method to call you to say there may be a disruption. And sometimes, as I had a person on Crestmore, that a pole was going to be replaced and there was going to be a disruption. Well, when we looked into it, there was not going to be a disruption to power, but there was just a miscommunication. So if they have your information, they can reach out to you directly. So I leave that, that's up there for us to pass it on. And so I appreciate it. And with that, we're going to go ahead and adjourn back to finish up the public employee performance evaluation pursuant to code 54957. With that, we'll adjourn to the next regular city council meeting to be held on April 28th, 2020. I'm sorry, that's the wrong one. May 12th, 2020. Good night, everyone.
Good night. Thank you.